Welcome to Nightward Echo. Tonight, in 7 true California stories from people who worked in haunted places, we step inside the jobs where daylight never truly reaches. From caretakers in crumbling hotels to night guards patrolling empty hospitals, these are the stories told by those who stayed long enough to feel the presence that never clocked out. Every account you're about to hear comes from real people who worked in places the living abandoned long ago. Janitors who heard footsteps in locked corridors, projectionists who saw figures behind the glass, and clerks who watched the shadows move on their own. My goal this month is to reach 200 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers listen and disappear without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what hour of the night it is for you. And if you've ever worked somewhere that felt wrong after dark, a diner, a warehouse, a hospital, type its name below. Because in California, some jobs never end. Kill the lights, silence the world, take a slow breath, and let us begin. I used to think the scariest part of working nights would be walking to my car at 2 a.m, with the bay fog rolling in and the gulls making those weird laughing sounds on the roof. That was before I took the projectionist job at the Monterey Bay Theater and learned the building itself keeps its own hours. I'm writing this because sleep hasn't helped, and my friends are tired of hearing me circle the same details like a stuck reel. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I just want it somewhere outside my head. The theater was one of those old beauties with a plaster ceiling full of painted stars and a lobby that smelled like butter and old carpet no matter how much citrus cleaner we used. It had been renovated. New seats, new DCP servers, LED aisle lights, but the bones were from another time. The projection booth still had a locked cabinet with a manual splicer and a rusted can opener for film tins, like someone would need them any minute. We kept them mostly because Marla, the owner, said they belonged to her dad, and it felt wrong to throw them out. She loved that place like an extra bedroom, which is probably why she never locked the upstairs hallway even though the air up there made your teeth ache at 11:30 on the dot. The first time I felt the temperature drop, I thought it was the AC damper stuck open. I went over to the vent with a flashlight and held my hand in front of it. The air wasn't blowing. It was just cold, like the hallway itself had exhaled. I rubbed my arms and went back into the booth to check the lens. We ran 2 houses at night, and I'd swing between rooms to nudge focus or check masking if we switched aspect ratios. My friend Kayla worked concessions and would bring me a small soda around midnight, the only perk of knowing the person with the syrup keys. And Luis, the night security guard, liked to hang by the north exit with his radio off and listen to the movies bleed through the wall. It felt like a small village of night people doing small night things. On my 4th shift, I was adjusting the keystone on House 2 and caught a shape in the glass of the booth window. It was a man in a brown vest holding a film reel under one arm. He looked like he was already halfway through a motion. Elbow out, wrist turning. That casual little shift a person does when they're about to set something down on a table. I spun around ready to say something and nearly smacked my forehead into the metal rack. The room behind me was empty. The only movement was the fan in the server and the slow sweep of dust in the projector's exhaust beam. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music, no gut punch fear. Just that instant of mistake when your brain says, oh, you caught a reflection of a poster or your own shoulder and made a person out of it. Then you stand there a second longer than you'd like, because if you leave too fast, you'll feel like you're running from something. I mentioned it to Marla the next day while she counted the drawer. Her left thumbnail was stained with permanent marker, like she'd been marking calendar squares for years. She never looked up when I said a guy in a brown vest because she already knew what that meant. That's my father, she said, or what everybody says of him. He died up there in '74, heart attack. We used to have a balcony, and he would thread the reels and listen for the cue bells. After he passed, people still heard the bell in the empty booth. They'd go in and the reels would be spun tight like someone checked their slack. She said it like she was telling me where to find the breaker panel, a fact, an instruction. He never missed a show, she added softer. He was particular. I thought she was trying to freak me out a little, the way old building owners do when they want you to respect the place. I made a joke about backup projectionists and she didn't laugh. So long as the doors are locked at the top of the hour, she said, you shouldn't have any trouble. I asked what doors. She turned her thumb up and touched the marker stain as if it itched. The booth, at 11:30. He kept everyone out when he was working. Ritual, you know? Don't start talking to the actors in your head. Just do the cues. After that, I started making a habit of turning the deadbolt on the booth door at 11:30, though I wasn't sure who I was keeping out. Kayla would tease me over the headset and call me old school, and I played into it, tapping the side of the projector like a ship captain checking a compass. Most nights, the worst thing that happened was a high school couple trying to sneak into a later show, or somebody complaining we kept it too cold. That coldness upstairs, though, the hallway between the two houses and the tiny storage closet with the mop sink, stuck to my skin like humidity, except it was the opposite. My fingers would go a little dumb. Sometimes I'd blow on them like a sax player warming up, and I'd catch my breath in the booth glass. And for a heartbeat, the breath would look like someone else's because I wouldn't recognize the shape of my own face in the reflection. Little things kept stacking up. The cue light on House 1 would blink 2 seconds early. The exit sign in the back row flickered whenever we hit the second act of certain movies. I could smell vinegar, old acetate film when the servers warmed up. The first time I found the logbook wedged behind the splicer, I thought it was a forgotten maintenance binder. It was bound in cracking brown, the kind of notebook with a little marbled pattern you'd see in a school desk from the 70s. And the first page said, "Projection Notes," in tight block handwriting. Then a list of dates, titles, and notations that sounded like someone whispering to you over your shoulder. Reel 2, soft right edge, adjust pad roller, patrons suite on row F, keep fader at 5.5. Wind out leader, strike on second bell. The last entry was a week before Marla's father died. It ended mid-sentence. If I'm not on at the bell, I didn't tell anyone about the notebook. It felt like opening someone's wallet. 2 weeks in, my older brother Nate came to a late showing after his shift at the marina. He's the kind of guy who rustles all the candy wrappers before the movie starts so he doesn't bother anyone later. He texted me that he was in the back row with a couple of his coworkers, and I nodded to the booth window like I could see him from there. Halfway through the feature, the DCP froze. Not a power loss. Not a skip. It was the kind of freeze where the frame just holds and waits for a new instruction and lights and sound continue, because they live in different systems. I swear there was a little pop like static. I rebooted the server. Kayla radioed from the lobby that a woman in a jean jacket was complaining and demanding a voucher. Luis walked the aisle with his flashlight like he owned the place. The system came back up, but the feature wouldn't resume. It wanted an input. It wanted something on the platter that wasn't there. I was alone in the booth when I heard the soft rattle of a metal can on the floor behind me. Not an earthquake bump. Not a mouse. A deliberate rattle, the sound of the lid of a film tin when someone sets it down a little too hard. I turned around slowly like I was trying to sneak up on a cat. The locked cabinet on the left, Marla's dad's cabinet, stood open. It had a keyed lock that I didn't have, and I swear on whatever part of this you're still with me on, that I hadn't touched it since the day Marla showed me the light switches. Inside, on the middle shelf, was a tin as big as a dinner plate with a torn label slapped crooked on the lid. House Reel. I did something I'm not proud of. Instead of calling anyone or getting permission, I took the tin out, sat on the edge of the table, and popped the lid. The smell of vinegar hit me first, then the softer smell of cardboard and dust. Inside was a roll of 35mm film that had clearly been spliced more times than I could count. The leader had bits of masking tape with pen notations like hand crank speed and baby face in aisle 3. When I held it up to the booth light and ran a few frames past my thumb, I didn't see a feature. I saw moments. A slow pan of the empty auditorium, a close-up on the brass cup holder armrest, a person's hand holding a pencil next to the focus ring, the top of someone's head as they leaned in to blow dust off a lens. It was like the booth had been documenting itself in pieces, ready to be threaded into a continuity that never existed. The DCP wouldn't run, and we had a theater full of people shifting in their seats and checking their phones and making the sound of an audience losing patience. I could have comped out the show, apologized over the intercom, and called it. Instead, I lifted the deadweight hood off the old projector we kept like a museum exhibit in the corner, lined up the feed sprockets, and threaded the leader the way I'd only learned in theory. My hands remembered a path they'd never taken. When I turned the motor, it wasn't just noise. It was a purr I recognized from a place I don't have words for. At 11:30, Right when that hallway decided our bones were optional, the booth door eased itself closed and clicked. I hadn't touched it. My radio gave a little squawk, then died. Kayla later said she thought I'd switched channels. Luis said he tried the handle and it wouldn't move. I felt none of that. All I felt was the rack under my palm and the warm tremble of film running true. The first thing on the screen was the auditorium. Our auditorium empty. The shot framed the aisle lights and the back exit door with the little square window. The focus was sharp. I could even see the tiny scuffs on the floor where the seats had been dragged during renovation. Then the frame cut, hard cut, splice visible, to a view of the booth glass from the outside. It was an angle I recognized from cleaning nights when we'd take a ladder into the house and wipe the window's hallway side. I could see my own silhouette behind the glass, hands on the controls. I froze, but the film didn't. A faint set of Q dots bloomed in the top right corner of the image like two escorted moons. The next splice jumped to a pair of hands laying a reel onto a table. Brown vest, repeated stitches in the fabric near the shoulder, like someone had mended it a dozen times and refused to buy a new one. I kept expecting the film to run out. It didn't. It was as if the reel was longer when it ran than it looked when it sat, like rope that keeps uncoiling from a box you thought was empty. In the projection window glass, my silhouette shifted slightly, and the silhouette in the film shifted a half-second later, like it was watching me and trying to keep up. I know how that sounds. I know the more I write that sentence, the less anyone wants to keep reading. If you've ever had your reflection do something your body hasn't committed to yet, you'll know the little zipper that opens under your ribs. Somebody knocked on the booth door with the flat of their hand. It had that dull quality of wood that's been painted too many times. "Hey!" Kayla, then Luis deeper. "You good up there?" The knocks were behind the sound of the machine, turned down in the mix of my attention. I saw movement in the reflection that didn't belong to me. The man in the vest stepped closer until his shoulder was almost touching mine in the glass. He held a reel against his hip with one hand and reached with the other like he meant to complete whatever motion I wouldn't. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that gets people into trouble, and I am not immune. I said out loud, "You've got it, boss," because it felt like that's what he wanted to hear. The old sound head ticked at the tail of a bad splice and then evened out. The image on screen, the audience still watching the screen of an empty audience, racked ever so slightly and popped into a sharper plane. In the house, people started murmuring. They weren't angry murmurs. They were the sound human beings make when they're invited to participate in something they don't yet understand. The next splice was home footage. Not ours. It looked like it had been shot on reversal stock. A Christmas tree in the lobby where the poster frames are now. A boy about 10 running up the long carpeted ramp that went to the old balcony. On the wall near the top of the ramp was a shadow in the shape of a man holding a small circle. The boy yelled, "Marla!" and the camera shook with laughter. There was no sound in the house. The old projector was not rigged to the modern audio. But the laughter lived in the image anyway, like a room you can see but not enter. I realized I'd been chewing the inside of my cheek as if taste could anchor me. I swallowed, and the room temperature dropped another notch. Someone slid a piece of paper under the booth door. I saw the corner of it brush over my shoe. The machine thrummed. The light from the port had that soft fuzz it gets when the glass is cold. I kept my hands on the guide rollers like I'd promised someone I'd never take them off. The paper said in black Sharpie, "Open now." The handwriting was Marla's, I think. Small, decisive. I tried the knob. It didn't move. I put my shoulder into it, not wanting to jostle the film path. I felt a pressure the other way, like someone had set their hand on the door on the far side and was giving it equal gentleness back. I thought weirdly of how you keep a kid from rushing into a parking lot by just putting an arm out without looking, like muscle memory. In the glass, the man with the vest raised his arm and pointed at the focus. It felt like he wasn't telling me to adjust it, so much as telling me to pay attention to what would happen if I did. I nudged it. The screen in the house, not the screen in the reel, but the actual screen, gave up being a flat rectangle for a second and looked like you could step through it into the aisle I was watching in the film. Then it went back to a picture like it had thought better of something. I didn't notice when Marla came upstairs because I was stupidly trying not to blink. She spoke first on the other side of the locked door, and her voice came through a vent, softened. "Gus," she said, and I stopped breathing because that was the name on the inside cover of the logbook. I'm here. I'm going to let him finish, and then we're going to open the door. You can do this without keeping someone. There was a pause, and then the film cut to black, not a tail off, not the end of a roll, just black like a choice. I waited for the take-up reel to slow. It didn't. The machine kept spinning as if something invisible was still passing through it. In the black, you could see the faint Q dots flash once, then again. On the third flash, the image came back, and it wasn't the auditorium anymore. It was the booth. Right then. Not a trick of angle, not a recorded version, but the booth as I stood in it, the little scuffed ring where my coffee cup had sat last week, the chip in the enamel on the cabinet, the paper like an island on the floor, and me, younger in the image by one heartbeat, because the film seemed to be just ahead of me. In the film my mouth moved like I was about to say, okay, and then, before my actual body could complete that sound, the man in the vest in the reflection reached out to rest his hand on my shoulder. I don't know if you've ever had an emotion you can't name because all the ones you know are already taken. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't relief. It was a kind of grief for things that have to repeat themselves because they never got to finish. I let the hand in the reflection touch me. I didn't turn around. This is important. I did not turn around. Every part of me wanted to. I kept my hands where they were, guiding a path for something that didn't have physical weight anymore. The machine sound softened. The frame held steady. The door behind me unlatched with a sound like a tongue leaving the roof of a mouth. Someone, Marla, I think, opened it an inch and then stopped, not wanting to startle whatever balance we'd found. Nate told me later that from the back row he'd stood up and then sat down 3 times because he didn't know if moving would break whatever he was watching. Luis said he had his flashlight in his hand and his radio pressed to his chest like he thought he could use them at the same time. Kayla said she kept telling people, it's part of it, even though she didn't know what she meant. Nobody left. That matters to me. Nobody left. The reel, which was a reel and also not a reel because by now we were well past what my hands expected, started to show frames of paper. Not the kind with images, the inventory kind. Torn corners. A number circled in pencil, 1130, another splice. The words "Stay on cue" scratched into a letter with a ballpoint. The words "Don't be late" on another. Then the closet with the mop sink and the minute hand of the clock on the wall trembling, like it was deciding which minute to belong to. I could feel a presence at my back, not leaning on me, but leaning near me. Like someone leaning on a counter in a kitchen that isn't theirs anymore, but still feels like it should be. When the final cue marks flickered, I did something I think saved me, though I can't prove it. I reached down and gently, carefully, as if I were lowering a sleeping baby into a crib, I slowed the feed with my fingers and let the last loop settle onto my palm, guiding it off the sprockets without letting it slap or catch. It meant the image didn't snap to white and the house lights didn't come up abruptly. It meant the theater got darkness the way you get night when your bedroom light goes out and your eyes negotiate what counts as black. The machine drifted down to a hum, then a purr, then the sound of something considering silence. I stepped back. The weight lifted off my shoulder. The cold climbed out of the bones of the booth and into the hallway like someone taking their coat back. Marla opened the door all the way. Her face looked a decade younger and a decade older at the same time. She didn't hug me, though she's a hugging kind of person. She put her hand on the old cabinet like she was grounding herself. "Thank you," she said, and she wasn't talking to me. She walked to the machine and, with more reverence than I've ever seen anyone give a piece of equipment, she turned it off. The fan spun a little longer than it should have, as if the air inside wanted one more lap. We comped the show, of course. Free passes. Apologies in the lobby. People were quiet, though. Not angry. They were in the mood audiences get, when they've been shown a magic trick and can't tell where the trapdoor is. Nate waited for me by the candy rack. He didn't make a joke. He put a hand on my elbow and looked at me in the particular way brothers have when they're checking for cracks. "You okay?" he asked. I told him I was. That was true and not true. Luis swore he'd seen a man standing in the upstairs hallway for a second when the house lights came up. He described the vest without prompting. Kayla said she heard bells, a faint double ding from the booth right before the door unlocked, like a timer you use for bread. Marla took the reel. She didn't put it back in the cabinet. She held it between both hands and walked it downstairs like a crown she wouldn't let anyone else carry. I don't know where she keeps it now. I didn't ask. After that, the temperature drop didn't stop. It still comes at 11:30 every night like tidewater. If I'm off, the guy covering for me texts to complain that his hands won't warm up. We lock the booth door at the top of the hour, not because we're scared, but because it feels like a courtesy. Sometimes, even when the DCP runs like it should, there's a flicker of dots in the corner of a scene where no editor put them. Sometimes the upstairs hallway smells like vinegar, even if the mop sink is dry. Sometimes the reflection in the booth glass is half a second ahead of me, and sometimes it's behind, like it can't decide if it wants to warn me or learn from me. A cop came by a week later to ask about a disturbance call from a neighbor. The neighbor swore they heard a film running at 1 in the morning when the theater was closed. The cop stood in the lobby and wrote in his notebook and tried to look like a person who has conversations like that every day. Marla handled it with that old-school calm she keeps in a drawer. After he left, she said without looking at me, he never missed a show. She said it with pride and exhaustion braided together. I told myself I'd quit after it got to me again, and it did. Of course it did. A Tuesday, slow night. 10 people in House 1 for a revival screening. The kind of audience that reads credits and claps for the matte painter. At 11:25, I felt the hallway lean cold like a weather front inside a building. I locked the booth door, not out of fear, but habit. I set my soda cup far from the controls because I imagined the old man in the vest would have yelled at me for condensation rings. I stared at the glass and tried not to make shapes out of the shine. In the window, nothing moved until I moved. That's a thing I've learned. If you stand still, the world will grant you a stillness back until it is ready to take its turn. I touched the focus ring. The image on the screen slid a breath and came clean. In the reflection, a second hand hovered an inch from the ring, patient, waiting, like the way a teacher waits to see if you'll get the answer before offering it. I whispered because I felt like I should. I've got it. The hand in the window didn't fall. It stayed there, not touching, not leaving, like a promise someone doesn't know how to keep or a habit someone doesn't know how to break. When I walk to my car now, the gulls sound the same and the fog still crawls up Alvarado like it pays rent, and the theater is just a building with lights you can turn off and a door you can lock. Except sometimes when I start the ignition, I get the sense that a show is starting somewhere inside that I didn't schedule. I'll look in the rear view and catch the smallest impression, a brown vest, a circle of film, and it'll vanish when I turn my head. I tell myself if I keep my back to the wall and my hands steady, if I stay on cue, if I remember that some jobs are rituals more than tasks, I'll walk away each night with my own shape inside my own body. I haven't missed a show since. I don't think I could, even if I tried. I don't usually post stuff like this, but it's been clinging to me in quiet moments, and I'm tired of pretending I don't hear it. I was a janitor at St. Helena Hospital for a little over 3 years, working the evening shift that bled into nights when the overtime was good. If you've ever set foot in a hospital after visiting hours, you know it's a different animal. The waiting rooms go from tense to hollow, the vending machines hum like they're trying to talk, and the fluorescent lights stop pretending to be daylight and go back to being what they are. Thin, cold sticks buzzing with a headache you can't rub away. People say hospitals feel haunted because of what happens there. I never believed it. I believed in clogged drains and black scuff marks and empty coffee cups jammed into potted plants. I believed in smells that stick to your clothes. Bleach, old coffee, hand sanitizer, that fake citrus they use to hide the other two. But the West Wing at St. Helena made me rethink things I never gave much thought to. It's been closed since the early 2000s after a small fire got into a wall cavity and smoked the place out. Not dramatic. No deaths anyone talked about. They sealed it off while the board figured out whether to remodel or demolish, put padlocks on the double doors, and slapped up the kind of faded yellow caution tape you don't notice anymore because it's become part of the architecture. My route was everywhere except there. ER hallways, surgical waiting, the long corridor that led to the locked West Wing. Those last 10 yards were mine. No patients at that end, no nurses walking through unless they forgot the detour and had to backtrack. It was always quiet enough to hear the air handler kick on like a far-off storm. There's a call light panel mounted at that end. One of those old annunciator boards with red squares next to room numbers and a tiny speaker that used to make a soft bing. Even after they shut the wing down, the box stayed. It was a relic. The first time the red light blinked next to 4W17, I thought I was seeing things. It was late October, the rain coming slantwise at the windows like the building had done something wrong. I had my cart parked in the alcove, restocking glove boxes and replacing an empty hand sanitizer bottle. Bing, and a red pulse like a tiny heartbeat. I froze with my hands inside the box of gloves, listening for footsteps, for a nurse saying, "Who's on call lights?" for any sign that a person was attached to the light. There was nothing. The wing was locked. Everyone knew it was locked. I set the sanitizer bottle down and stepped over to the panel. The light blinked again, steady rhythm. Patient pressed the button on the bed. "Please help me." The wiring insisted in its little red square. I stared like staring would make the light decide it had made a mistake. Then the old habit kicked in. If a call light is going off, you clear it. You don't make people wait. You sure as hell don't ignore it. I pressed the rubbery silence button on the panel. The light stopped. The tiny speaker ticked once. I remember noticing my reflection in the panel's plastic cover. I looked tired. There's something about seeing yourself in hospital glass that makes your face look like it belongs to somebody else. I went back to the cart. 5 doors down near the gurney alcove, Bing and 4W12 started blinking. Not frantic, just patient. I didn't go back to the panel that time. I waited. The light blinked. The sound wasn't loud, but in an empty hallway it wrote itself into your ears. I hit silence again. That night I told Manny about it in the break room. He was another janitor, older than me by 20 years. A guy who could coax the buffing machine like it was a dance partner. Manny wore his baseball cap backwards and had a voice like he'd been eating gravel since 1998. He laughed when I told him. "You're getting the new guy initiation, amigo," he said. "Someone tied the call light wires under the floor. Runs on the emergency circuit. They do it every couple years. Security'll pull the fuse tomorrow." Manny always said "they" when he meant nobody. The next night I swallowed the dumb feeling and mentioned it to Rosa, one of the night shift security guards who did rounds with a clipboard and a flashlight that could cut through fog. Rosa didn't laugh. She wrote something down. "It's not on the board," she said, meaning the list the charge nurse keeps of out-of-service stuff, half superstition, half accountability. "If it does it again, radio me." It did it again twice that week, always starting with a different room number, 4W20, 4W08, 4W21, never frantic. Never more than one at a time, never at a predictable hour. Once it binged while I was hauling trash and I let it go for 30 seconds, just to see if any other lights would join in like some kind of electrical chorus. They didn't. I'd tap silence and the hallway would go back to what it was. I didn't like the way my shoulders rose without me telling them to. After the 4th incident, Rosa came down with her flashlight. She stood with me by the panel, her radio on her belt, the rain soft drumming the windows. The light was lit next to 4W14. "It's dead," she said, meaning the wing. "There's not even power." She tapped her flashlight against the wall next to a junction box like she could hear electricity. Then she keyed her radio and called facilities. 10 minutes later, Dina from facilities arrived, hair in a loose bun, keys in a bunch big enough to break a window. If Manny was the dance partner guy for the buffer, Dina was the one who knew what every key did and who hated half of them. She popped the faceplate off the panel with something that looked like a flathead screwdriver, but probably had a fancy name. Inside was a nest of colored wires that didn't mean anything to me. Dina flicked a tester at a couple and stared at the tiny screen. "No feed," she said. "No return either." She gave me the eyes, the ones that say, "Don't make this my problem." "You sure it's not reflecting the main wing?" I didn't know what she meant. She put the cover back on, wrote down a work order number nobody would type into a computer, and left. Rosa stood there a second longer with me. 4W14 kept blinking. I pressed silence. We didn't talk about it as a group after that. Hospitals have a way of swallowing the absurd under paperwork. There's always something real to deal with. Family shouting in the ER, an IV pole stuck, a toilet overflowing. Those things keep you practical. I started bringing my own little radio with earbud headphones to listen to baseball recaps while I mopped. The call lights fit themselves between innings. I stopped looking at the numbers and hit the silence button without reading it, like swatting a mosquito. On a Tuesday in November, the air outside cold enough to make the automatic doors hesitate, Manny got assigned to help me strip the floor wax on the east corridor. We worked our way down toward the west wing end as the hours got thin. The floor machine whirred, the smell of ammonia climbed into our sinuses, and the plastic wet floor signs we set spaced like little soldiers, glowed yellow under the fluorescence. The hospital was as quiet as it gets, which is to say not quiet at all, but the noises were mechanical, predictable, the ice machine coughing, distant intercom murmurs, a roll of thunder with no lightning. We were putting the last pass on the wax when I heard it, not the call light. A different sound, older, a gurney wheel with grit in its axle. That squeak, sticky rubber grinding. It came from behind me. I turned and looked down the empty corridor to the locked double doors of the west wing. The doors were closed. The squeak came again, closer. Manny looked up. His eyebrows twitched under the brim of his cap. "That's not funny," he said automatically, which is what you say when you think something is funny and you're a little worried it might not be. I didn't answer because I was counting without meaning to. The squeak would come, and in the space between squeaks I could feel my brain measuring distance. If you've ever waited for a train you can't see but you can hear, you know what I mean. The squeak stopped. We waited and did that thing where you're a grown person pretending to be casual in a hallway. "Rosa?" Manny called, not loud, like he didn't want the sound to go too far. Nothing. The call light panel let out a single tiny bing. 4W22 started blinking. "Hilarious," Manny muttered. But he was looking at the floor now, not the panel. We both were. The wax reflected the lights. Near the door, just where the corridor turned, the reflection rippled. Gurney wheels leave tracks if the floor is dusty. That's something you know when you clean. The corner by the west wing had been dusty for years because it never got traffic and nobody policed the edges like they should. I caught Manny's eye and we set our mops aside at the same time without talking. We walked toward the door. There were tracks clear as the fingerprints on a glass, too narrow. Ribbons side by side, the width of a gurney's wheels. They didn't snake like something rolled them from behind a human. They were straight, mostly. Manny crouched. He put a finger on the track like he didn't think it would be there and needed to check if the floor had drawn it in marker. When he stood, we followed the tracks backward because where they started mattered more than where they went. They began at the wall. Not the floor against the wall, but the wall itself. Just to the right of the crash bar on the double doors, like something had pushed out of the concrete and laid tracks on the linoleum. The lines ran toward us. They ended right at my toes. My shoes nudged the wax and left their own crescent smears. Mundane and human and ridiculous next to those straight lines. I don't remember deciding to do it, but my hand landed on the crash bar and I pushed. The doors didn't move. Manny said my name the way people say your name when they want it to turn into a different person. I took my key ring out and chose the big brass one Rosa had showed me once. The key for that door. I had never used it. The brass was dull and left a metallic smell on my thumb. I slid it in, turned until I felt a click and pushed the crash bar again. The doors opened without the usual beep from the sensor. No chime from the alarm. Nothing but the soft rubber sigh of seals letting go. The west wing smelled like old books left in a garage. Dust and char and that cold dry air certain rooms get when they regret you opening them. We didn't step more than a foot inside. Our flashlights chased the light shafts and each other. The rooms lining the hall were half cloaked under plastic sheeting taped at the corners, the stickers curling with age. The floors were filmed with the kind of dust that shows footprints like wet sand. Our breath made little puffs. Deeper in, somewhere I couldn't name, something ticked. The call light panel behind us binged again. I felt it more than heard it in the muscles of my neck. I turned around and checked the panel. Now 2 were lit, 4W17 and 4W18. "Close it," Manny said. I didn't. You can judge me for that, but at the time it felt like turning away from a stove with a flame on a paper towel. The thing to do was either put it out or let the whole house go. I picked the closest room, 4W16, and stepped through the plastic flap. The room was a square with a bed frame with no mattress, an IV stand leaning like a metal reed, and a window with the blind half tilted so that a stripe of light hit the opposite wall exactly. The call button hung from the bed's side unplugged. The nurse station button next to the door was yellowing plastic with a rubber taste in the air, like old erasers. I pressed it out of habit. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. I came back out. Manny hadn't moved. He had the second mop handle in his fist like a staff. We stood there, 2 grown men with flashlights and mops like cartoon security. "Rosa," Manny said and reached for his radio. It crackled. He asked her to come down. She said she was 2 floors up and would be a minute. The line clicked and went silent again. The panel in the hall binged and now 4W21 lit up. The lights were going in order. We were standing at 4W16. I wish I could say we left then. What we did was what hospital people always do. We followed the behavior we were trained for. Lights go off, you clear them. I moved to 4W17, pushed the door open with my knuckles like muscle memory demanded, glanced at the unplugged call pendant, and stepped back out. The light on the panel behind us dimmed, then went dark. I didn't press silence. I didn't need to. We looked at each other. Manny nodded once. We went to 4W18, same thing. Pendant like a tongue of plastic hanging over the bed. No power, press, silence without sound. The light went out. It felt against all sense like something was pleased with us for understanding the job. The tracks on the floor, which I'd been trying not to look at, now had faint drag marks across them where our shoes smeared them. They'd been crisp before. That for some reason made my stomach drop. The panel binged again. So we're 19. Farther down the hall, somewhere the gurney squeaked. We cleared 19. Then 20. We didn't talk. Part of me was embarrassed. Part of me was moving like I do when I'm dragging a bag of trash I know is too heavy for one run. But I'm already committed. In the next room, there was a shadow that didn't belong to us. I know how that sounds, but if you stand in a room long enough with a flashlight, you understand how your own shape behaves, how the bed frame makes a rectangle, how the IV stand makes a stem with leaves. This was a shape that leaned against the stillness like heat in air over a road. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could name. It rode the stripe from the half-tilted blind and seemed to swell gently when the air handler kicked. I said hello. I don't know why. It felt rude not to. Manny said my name again in a smaller voice. We stepped back. That was when we heard the wheels. Not down the hall this time, but inside the room across from us, the one we hadn't opened yet. 2 squeaks and then the gentle swing of metal tapping a wall. We both looked through the little rectangle of wired glass in the door. There was a gurney in there under a sheet of clear plastic taped to itself, the kind you throw over furniture when you paint. It was in the center of the room. The bed frame was against the wall. I was cataloging that like it mattered. The gurney moved under the plastic, not rolling. A subtle shift like someone on it changed their mind. The plastic crinkled. The panel binged again. 4W22. The wing was making us walk away from whatever we thought we saw. Close it, Manny said again, louder. He reached for the doors. I took one more step into the open doorway of the room with the shadow and pressed the dead call button out of a stubbornness that felt like defiance. The button clicked flat. I had the dumb idea that if I pressed all of them, we'd get to the end of the hall and whatever was playing games would find itself out of reasons. Rose's flashlight beam hit the far wall just then like a thrown spear. She stepped into view with the confidence of someone who'd walked into worse. "What are you doing?" she asked, but her voice had that helpful softness nurses have, not the reprimand of a teacher. She swung her light into the room with the gurney. The plastic sheet lay flat and still. The wheels did not squeak. She swept the beam down to the floor and her light found the tracks. "Nope," she said. "Nope. Out." We backed up and she put a hand on my shoulder without looking and pushed exactly hard enough to tell me who was in charge. She closed the double doors to the west wing with both hands like she was settling a lid on a reluctant pot. The latch clicked. The call light panel in the hall did not stop binging. 4W22 flashed. Rosa took her radio and called Dina. She didn't ask politely this time. Dina arrived with a different set of keys. She had a power tester again, and this time a handheld meter with a needle that trembled in the middle like it was undecided. She opened a little electrical panel under the annunciator. Inside was clean metal, wires bundled and labeled with tiny print. She clipped the tester on and shook her head. "No voltage," she said. The needle on the meter did not move. The light next to 4W22 kept blinking and the soft bing felt like it had moved into my teeth. "Then why is it doing that?" Rosa asked. Dina watched the light blink for a while. She wrote something in her notebook like writing it down turned a weird noise into a job. "Sometimes ghost voltage," she said. "Old wires pick up electromagnetic fields. But this is too regular." She flashed me an expression that translated roughly to, "I don't like this hallway, and I don't like you for making me be in it." The gurney squeak came again from behind the doors we'd just shut. The three of us looked at the door like it was a person who'd just whispered a slur. Rosa put a hand on her radio and said, "Okay, in that way that means not okay." She jutted her chin at me and Manny. "You two, go, sign out. I'll sit here and watch the panel until Dina finds the nothing that's causing this." We didn't argue. The hospital had taught me to recognize when I was being dismissed with kindness. On the way back to the janitor's closet, Manny said, "We're not coming back down here tonight." I nodded. "Promise me," he said like a kid. I promised. The next morning, the head of environmental services called us into his office. He's a man named Kemp with the tidy beard of someone who's read a lot of management books and decided clean edges make people behave. He told us there had been a complaint not about us, but about inappropriate use of restricted areas. That was the phrase he used. I opened my mouth to explain and then closed it because I could picture his face not wanting the explanation. He told us to avoid the west wing end of the hall except for necessary duties, and to ask security for escort if there were any further anomalies. He looked down at his desk when he said the last word. I spent the morning doing supply runs and the afternoon stripping a break room floor that hadn't seen the scrubbing machine in months. I tried not to think about the gurney. By 10, when the building thins out to skeleton crew, I found myself pushing the cart down toward my end of the hall like a man walking to his own front door. You could call it curiosity. It felt more like gravity. The call light panel was dark. The double doors stood closed. The yellow tape, older than me, sagged in one loop. I parked the cart and pretended to have a reason to be there. I checked the glove stocks in a dispenser that was already full. I wiped an invisible fingerprint off the stainless water fountain. I waited. When nothing happened, I felt stupid. And then relieved. And then, in an embarrassing way, disappointed. The building ran on with its nighttime music. On my way back up the hall, I heard a soft roll behind me, like my cart had moved on its own and was catching up. The hairs on my arms rose. I turned. The cart hadn't moved, but on the wax a new set of narrow tracks had appeared, so fresh the dust still lifted from the edges like mist. They ran from the wall to where my cart's back wheels were, then stopped. I took 2 steps forward and the tracks followed me for those 2 steps, extending themselves like they were being written as I moved. I stopped moving. The tracks stopped. When I walked backward, the tracks did not retreat. They reached me again. This is the part people argue about when I tell it, so I don't try to convince anyone. I placed my foot down deliberately. The dust smudged under my shoe like normal, but the 2 narrow lines connected to that step a second later like a pen drawing after the fact. I didn't smell plastic or metal. I didn't feel cold. It was just me and the building and the tracks that wanted to be where I was going. I left. I pushed the cart faster than it liked and took a corner too sharply and a box of gloves slid off, and I didn't stop to pick it up. In the janitor's closet, I locked the door, though no one ever comes in there except people like me. The faucet dripped twice in the stainless sink. I rested my hands on the counter until they stopped shaking. Manny found me and said nothing for a minute. Then softly, "Me too." He held his hands out and they were shaking like he was trying to bounce a coin off them. We didn't report that part. There's only so much you can make into an incident report before it becomes a story. And stories don't get filed. They get told, and then they get you reassigned. For the next week, nothing obvious happened. The panel stayed quiet. The gurney didn't squeak. I did my routes and listened to the low murmur of sports talk in one ear, and tried to make the hospital a series of tasks again. Except now I'd catch myself walking and feel my feet shorten their stride because of the memory of lines appearing behind me. I started to count my steps down the last hall, changing the pattern on the idea that whatever was listening wouldn't recognize me if I didn't walk like myself. Rosa caught me doing it one night and asked, "You counting?" I said, "Sometimes it helps." She didn't ask what. On a Wednesday, a little before midnight, the fire alarm hiccuped. Not a full blare, just a stutter and a whoop like the building cleared its throat. The lights didn't flash. The intercom crackled with someone's voice telling us to disregard a test. But the west end of the hall got colder by a degree or 2. I felt it on the back of my neck because that's where the drafts always find you. I looked down the corridor. The double doors were open. The tape hung from one hinge like a loose bandage. I didn't open them. That's important to say. I did not open the doors. Manny wasn't on shift that night. I thought about calling Rosa and decided I'd rather be embarrassed later than be alone now. I took my phone out to call her, and the first bing made the glass in my hand tremble just enough to make it seem alive. For a W20, then 19, then 18. The panel lit in a pattern that wasn't how it had been before. It was skipping rooms. It was spelling something, if lights can spell. I didn't want to know the word. I pressed silence and the light didn't stop. The soft bing kept time like a sometimes friend who doesn't realize you're in trouble. I realized then that I could hear wheels. Not squeaking now, but rolling on well-cleaned linoleum, with that whisper slap that smooth rubber makes when it passes over floor wax applied by somebody who cares. The sound wasn't behind the door. It was behind me. The hallway that led to the elevators was empty. The whisper slap kept coming in a slow, steady rhythm, and for a weird second I was comforted because a slow gurney means no emergency. My brain grabbed at normal explanations even as my gut wanted to leave my body. I stood still. The sound stopped 10 feet away, right under the hospital sign that says, "Please maintain quiet hours, visitors." I didn't turn around because sometimes your instincts are smarter than your pride. I talked instead. "I'll clear the lights," I said, and my voice didn't tremble, which felt like a victory. "I'll do my job." I walked backward until my elbow touched the panel. I kept my eyes on the empty hall. I pressed each lit square with the flat of my thumb. They dimmed, then winked out obediently like dogs told to lie down. When the last one went dark, the whisper slap of unseen wheels lifted off the wax like someone had stepped off a treadmill. The double doors to the west wing eased themselves closed in what felt like a polite gesture. The latch clicked. The hallway felt like a room after a funeral, when someone has finally taken the casserole dishes away. People asked me later, Manny and Rosa and even Dina in her way, why I didn't leave then or ask for a transfer, or do anything that makes more sense than continuing to push a cart down that corridor. I don't have a sensible answer. I told myself the building had quirks. I told myself we'd all seen worse, and we had, just in a different category. I told myself that noticing is not the same as inviting. That last part might be the lie. The winter set in and the windows got that tight, brittle look, like frost had left fingerprints. I started picking up extra shifts to float holidays because the pay was better and I don't have kids. The west wing doors started to play a new trick. They wouldn't be open, but they'd be unlatched. You could press your palm and they'd give like someone breathing. One time I leaned my ear to the crack and heard the soft scrape of something sliding on tile far inside. The way a chair being nudged sounds when nobody wants to admit they moved it. I got into the habit of putting the rubber wedge down at the base of the doors when I was working nearby. Like a literal boundary would translate into a symbolic one. You learn to negotiate with buildings. And then the last thing happened. Not the biggest, not the loudest, just the one that scratched a line under everything and told me the math came out to a number I didn't want to see. It was a Sunday. The floor team short 2 people, so I was alone near the west wing while the others worked upstairs. A nurse from ICU I barely knew came down that hall to toss a coffee cup in the bin and give her legs a walk. She was new, young, braid too tight, a badge that still clicked too much against her lanyard. She said, "Is that wing as creepy as everyone says?" I said, trying for light. "Only if you let it." She smiled like people do when they think you're being cute and not careful. Then she looked at the panel. "Why does that one keep blinking?" It wasn't. I turned automatically because she'd set it the way you call attention to a bug on someone's shoulder. 4W12 was lit. I hadn't heard it. No bing, just the light. Without me thinking about it, my hand reached for the silence button and stopped an inch above. The ICU nurse had her head tilted like a dog. "I can hear it," she said. Her eyes weren't on the panel. They were on the doors.
"Hear what?"
I asked. And even I could hear how I asked it, like she'd said the secret answer to a question I didn't want to learn. "Someone with a bad cough," she said, and made a little face like she wanted to be sympathetic, but it wasn't in her job description. She wasn't kidding. She took a step toward the double doors and I stood in front of her because that felt suddenly important. She looked at me like I was the creepy thing now. The cough sounded like a person trying not to cough. A small, dry sound. Then the catch of someone apologizing with their body. It was on the other side of the doors and it didn't have anywhere to go. My hands remembered the feel of pushing those doors. They remembered the weight and the bounce. The ICU nurse's hand came up like she might push past me. I said, "I'll get security," too fast, and she read my voice and stepped back. She nodded because she was trained to trust people in uniforms or with keys. I radioed Rosa. She said she was on her way. I stood there with a young nurse who could hear a cough I could not. The cough happened again. She looked at me with eyebrows that tried to make me hear with my forehead. The panel light turned off without me touching it. The cough stopped. Rosa arrived and we stood there, the 3 of us, not opening the doors, not pretending we would. We didn't call Dina. We didn't write a work order. We just stood until the hallway became a hallway again, and the automatic doors at the far end exhaled and somebody said code blue ICU over the intercom, and the young nurse got called back to her floor and left, with her steps too fast to call casual. After that, the building behaved. A week of ordinary quiet. The doors stayed latched. The panel didn't blink. I walked like myself without counting. I was relieved. Then I was suspicious of relief. That's when I quit. I told Kemp I needed a schedule change he couldn't accommodate, which was true enough. He wished me well and asked for my ID badge and keys. I handed them over and felt like I was giving the hospital back the only protection I had. On my last night, Manny shook my hand like we were two men who had built a shed together and would remember the way the boards fit forever. Rosa gave me a look that said more than a hug would have. Dina wasn't around. I took one last slow walk down the corridor, pushing an empty cart that felt like a prop because after years of hauling, pushing something light confuses your body. I stopped at the end where the panel lives and the doors sleep. They were closed. The wedge was in place. I stood until the building reminded me it had other things to do besides indulge my sentiment. I said out loud because it felt right, "Good night." The panel did not blink. The building did not answer. I drove home with the radio off and the window cracked because the air outside felt better than anything processed. I slept well for the first time in weeks. I think it's important to say that. The world doesn't always reward you with drama when you do something hard. Sometimes the gift is just 6 hours without dreaming about gurney wheels. The next morning I made coffee and stood by the window of my apartment and watched a bus go by with its sign flickering between Route and 12, because some old wire in it had ideas. I took a sip and let the warmth anchor me. That's when I heard it. Not a bing, a softer sound like a coin dropped into water. It came from my kitchen wall, where the pipe for the sink runs, then from the hallway wall, then from the living room, as if my apartment had a cheap, patient annunciator system installed overnight, and was trying to get my attention in a language it assumed I knew. I set the cup down. I waited, nothing more. I told myself it was the building, pipes, settling, neighbors. I told myself it was my brain wanting what it had been fed. I went to the sink, ran the water, listened to it fill the basin, turned it off. The silence felt staged. I don't have a panel here. I don't have a key that turns anything. I don't have a wing to avoid and a wedge to set. But sometimes when the rain slants at my window just right, and the refrigerator hums in that particular register that fluorescents favor, I'll hear a single, polite, almost apologetic bing come from a wall that has never contained more than drywall and studs. It's soft enough that if you told me it wasn't there, I'd agree to keep the peace. When it happens, I put my hand out like I'm about to press a button that doesn't exist, and I think about doors that open with no tone, and tracks that start where tracks shouldn't. Then I do what we do in hospitals when we're undertrained for the strange and overtrained for the routine. I continue with my task. Tell myself I'm clearing the light, and try not to notice that in the thin film of dust that gathers on the sill by my window, two narrow lines sometimes appear side by side, straight as new wire, and stop exactly where my feet always end up. I've rewritten this post 3 times because it keeps coming out sounding dramatic, and I hate that. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm just tired, and this is the only way I know to stop replaying certain sounds in my head. If you've ever heard a bell ring when the rope is still and the clapper shouldn't be moving, you'll understand a little of it. If you haven't, imagine a wrong note in a quiet room that you can't unhear. I never thought the quiet could have edges until I worked nights at the mission. I took the groundskeeper job because it meant steady work with windows of solitude. San Luis Obispo is noisy on weekends with students and wine people, but the old mission sits a little apart, wrapped in its own breath. By day it's white adobe and patient roses and school groups trying to whisper. By night the fog comes in from the coast, strip by strip, and it sticks to the clay roof tiles and the cypress shadows and dampens the world until it feels like sound is being stored somewhere. My tasks were simple. Lock the courtyard gates at 9, check the chapel and museum rooms, irrigate the beds on Tuesdays and Fridays, sweep the nave when needed, keep the bell ropes tied off, and be kind to the docents even when they forgot I had a name. I wasn't alone most nights. My friend Andy picked up shifts as a part-time security guard to help cover rent. He's taller than me and not easily rattled, former EMT, hands steady even in noise. He liked to bring a thermos and split it with me by the fountain, where we'd watch moths thrum around the lanterns. The parish priest, Father Miguel, lived in the rectory wing. He was a practical man who wore running shoes under his cassock and kept a small radio on his desk tuned to the local station. We also had background regulars, a neighbor named Ms. Klein who called whenever teenagers sat on the low wall after dark, an older docent, Lorraine, who disapproved of my beard, a deputy named Rocha who swung by at odd hours because his uncle had been buried here in the 70s, and the place made him feel calm. I'm telling you all that so you know this isn't a story about me sleeping in a haunted building and losing my mind in isolation. There were people in and out, we joked. We argued over which broom actually did better against grit, tracked in by 1,000 sandals. It felt in a very ordinary way alive. The small things started in late September. The bells in the tower, 4 bronze mouths that take muscle to move, sometimes answered the wind. You learn the sound of wind through a bell. It has a hollow sympathy to it, a breathy moan. This was different. Single notes off the hour, separated by long quiet. I'd be rolling the hose back on its rack and hear a soft, almost apologetic ding from above. The first time I went up, the tower has a narrow stair that smells like coins and old rope. The ropes were still tied off to their cleats. No draft. I told myself old buildings flex, metal responds, and went back down, collecting the stray leaves from the courtyard with my hand. Later, sweeping the chapel, I noticed the votive candles along the east wall were burning in a way I don't have words for. Steady flames that were somehow bent, as if pulled sideways by a magnet. There was no open door, no movement of air I could feel on my skin. When I stood close, the wicks leaned toward me in tiny bows until my shirt caught the light warmth, and the flames did a little shiver. Then straightened. I pinched them out. The room smelled like beeswax and damp stone, and for a moment the hairs on my arm lifted as if something were exhaling nearby. I mentioned the candles to Father Miguel the next morning when I was trimming the rosemary along the pathway, and he came outside with a mug and a half smile. He didn't take the bait of dramatics. This place has its rhythms, he said. There's a week in the fall when even the radios buzz. Bells do funny things when fog rolls in. I'd ask you not to think about it too much. When I asked if there was an event, a feast day, some reason, he tapped the rim of his mug. An anniversary of sorts, he said, and then he looked at the cypress and not at me. We don't make a bulletin of it. Andy found that funny. Priests love their secrets, he said that night, passing me the thermos by the fountain. His breath broke white in the air. A bus sighed at the light on Monterey Street, and a couple laughed down the sidewalk. You know, he added, some of those bells are wired to an old electric striker. Lightning storms used to set them off. Maybe a relay's glitching. I like that. It's comforting when someone you trust can point to a wire, except that the little things multiplied in a way wires don't explain. I started finding dirt where there shouldn't be dirt. Not grit from shoes. Dirt with weight to it, damp and finely crumbled, the color of unglazed clay. It showed up under the first pew twice, a faint crescent, like someone had dragged their heel just inside the aisle. I vacuumed and chalked it up to a pot that had been moved. Then it appeared on the wooden threshold outside the sacristy, a small pour like someone had emptied a pocket. I checked the pots in the courtyard and found them all undisturbed. I swept, went about my rounds, then doubled back and saw a single line of it along the edge of the nave. Thin as if sifted through a fist, I'm aware of how that reads: dirt, bells, candles. It sounds like I'm building a case out of lint, but the quiet of the place made those small elements loud. I started to take extra care with the keys. Heavy ring, each door a different tooth. The museum, the little room with the old vestments, the archive in the back that smells like paper and lemon oil. Nothing was ever open that I hadn't opened, and yet the sense that something was moving slightly ahead of me, just out of my sight line, grew. One evening a tour ran late. Lorraine the docent argued with a college kid about touching the mission model, and I lingered by the arch to keep a third presence so the tone stayed civil. We closed a little after 9. I locked the south gate, hung the chain through its loop, pocketed the padlock key, and did my round with Andy. We found nothing, signed the log on the office clipboard, and sat by the fountain. Fog was slipping down the street like someone had opened a slow faucet. Around 10, I heard a bell note. Not ding-dong, just ding. I looked up at the tower. Andy didn't move. Don't, he said. You go up, it invites attention. From who? I said, and I tried to sound like I was making a joke. but my throat tightened anyway. At 11, lights out, we made one last check. The chapel was dark and cool, the moon filling the square of the high window like a coin submerged in milk. My flashlight slid along the pew tops. That's when we saw the candles. We keep the votives locked in a small cabinet near the altar. 5 were lit, in a straight line on the floor of the nave, wicks bright and unbothered, and something else near them that made me stop my breath. There was a handprint in the dust by the first candle. Not ash, not spilled wax, a print made in fine damp dirt pressed down by someone's palm. The fingers were long, and at the pad of the thumb there was a small crack like a dried river. Silly detail to fixate on, but that's what my eyes locked to. Andy said a low word I won't repeat and stepped past me and put his boot down over the print. He blew out the candles. Smoke rose and flattened in the cold. After that, Father Miguel agreed we should install motion sensors in the nave. Deputy Rocha, when he stopped by on his rounds, offered to do an extra loop at night. Kids, he said, like naming it made the field smaller. Your south wall is an easy hop if you're tall. We walked it together by flashlight and found scuffs on the stucco from years of shoes. Nothing fresh. Rocha rapped the wall with his knuckle. Sound carries oddly in here. I've heard my own voice return to me like somebody else's. He looked up at the tower and narrowed his eyes. You keep those ropes tied off, he said. I dream about ropes sometimes. I wake up with a taste in my mouth like pennies. I considered calling in sick the following Wednesday, but the thought of avoiding it made me feel smaller than I wanted to feel. So I went in early and stayed late. I polished the altar rail. I scrubbed the fountain rim with a bristle brush and left the smell of diluted bleach in my wake like a warning. I wove labels through the irrigation valves with my own name written on tape as if marking them would mark the day as mine. The fog came early, milky and soft, and my radio slipped in and out of range like a fish I couldn't net. When the bells started that evening, they did it in a rhythm that made even Andy look over his shoulder. It was the week, I would learn, that they never put in the bulletin. The anniversary Father Miguel had shrugged about. Later, when I had a shape to hang it on, I found the words to ask directly. Back then, it was only sound and a heaviness in the air like when a storm sits over the hills and doesn't choose. A note at 8:12, another at 8:25. A third that I felt more than heard around 8:40, the bronze holding something too low for my ear but not for the bones in my jaw. By 9, the courtyard had sunk into a kind of thick quiet. When I closed the gate, the chain seemed noisier than usual. And when I turned, I swear the courtyard was different by some degree that has no numerical value. The cypress leaned. The roses turned their dark heads. I looked at the dark square of the chapel doorway and felt the same small lift of hairs along my arms as before. I don't remember deciding to go in. I remember the feeling of my own footfalls, soft and disloyal. Andy was at the far end of the arcade on his phone, checking a schedule for his EMT recertification. I pushed the chapel door and went down the aisle with my flashlight at thigh level. The air had that overnight refrigerator weight that you only recognize if you've worked in old buildings. At the front, I turned and let the beam skate back. Halfway down by the 4th pew, the light caught something like a seam in the floor. The chapel floor is flagstone in front and worn wood in back. This was where they meet. A thin shift in surface that I had walked 100 times and never noticed the hairline in. The beam glinted off something softer than stone, softer than wood. I crouched and my knee popped and I put my hand down to steady myself and felt that damp dust again. A line as thin as a string ran along the seam, and in the dust beside it, faint as if it had been pressed days ago, was another partial handprint. Not full. Just the heel of a palm and 2 finger pads. The print pointed toward the altar. If you think I lifted the board right then and there, you haven't worked in a place that isn't yours. You don't start prying up floors in a historic chapel. You mark it in your mind and you stand up and you make a plan. I stood. I turned to go get Andy. I took 2 steps and froze at the sound of rope whispering over wood from above me. The bell ropes live in the tower, but the whisper had the same grain to it, the same fibrous sound. I looked up and saw nothing. Then I heard a dull thud against the tower wall like someone testing a weight. I ran for the door. Running in a chapel feels like a crime. The night air hit my face like a damp cloth. Andy, I said, and my voice was too thin and I had to say it again. He was already coming toward me. You hear that? He asked. The bells were ringing, soft as if someone were closing their hand around each note. We both looked up. The tower was a darker rectangle against dark. I thought of the ropes coiled like sleeping animals, of the knot I had tied, of the chalk mark I'd made on the cleat out of a stupid superstition to see if the coil shifted. We climbed. I didn't want to. The stairs were narrower than my feet wanted them to be, and the sounds changed in a way that made them seem to move both closer and further. Halfway up, I smelled dampness that wasn't the usual stone-cold smell, earth damp like the underside of a lifted pot. The bell chamber is spare. Light comes in through the louvered openings, the ropes hang down. The beams cross overhead with old carpenter's marks. The coil was still on its peg. The knot was tight. No movement. Electric striker? Andy whispered, but that didn't fit either. The striker is a small hammer that taps one of the bells on holidays. It's wired and obvious. It wasn't moving. I reached out and touched the rope. It was tauter than it should have been, as if something heavy had leaned its weight against the bell and set the rope singing a little in sympathy. For a heartbeat or two, the fiber under my fingers felt warm. I let go and wiped my palm on my jeans and wished that I hadn't come up here at all. Just then we heard the front chapel door below open and close. That thud is unmistakable, a particular wood and iron kiss. Andy looked at me and I saw him calculate options the way he must have in ambulances. He moved toward the stair. "Don't," I said, and I know how that sounds. Don't do the obvious safe thing. But I had a sense that if we met whatever had come in at the narrow part of the stair, it would be worse. We stood in a silence that wasn't silent because you could hear the fog outside lick at the openings. The faint hiss of Monterey Street beyond, and under it all a softer thing. Like the sound a shovel makes when it bites into damp ground, a quick choke and release. It was not a sound that belongs in a bell tower. We went down together anyway. Some orders of fear are bigger than others. Andy went first. His shoulders filled the stairwell and gave me something I could follow. When we reached the nave, it was empty in the most complete way, as if it had been empty for 100 years. The open door smell was there, that faint bloom of air. The candles along the east wall were lit again, 3 this time, placed in a triangle where the seam met the wood. The line of fine dirt had widened, no longer a string but a narrow error, as if the wood had lifted a hair's breadth and then settled again. Andy knelt. His hand hovered and didn't touch. He looked at me. "We need to tell Miguel," he said. Now we split. He went for the rectory. I went for the breaker box because some old part of me wanted light, wanted to burn the fog out of the corners. The box is in a little alcove near the museum door. As I turned, the south gate chain rattled. It wasn't wind. It was the sound of a chain picked up and then set down carefully enough to make you want to say a name. I stepped into the arcade and looked into the courtyard and didn't go farther because bare feet were standing just inside the gate. Not a full person, just feet, pale in the dim, toes curled at the edge of the tile. The rest of the body must have been behind the column and the cypress shadow. The trick of light made the ankles look wrong, too slender, as if they'd never borne weight. I stepped back into the alcove and my keyring knocked the wall, a loud, bright clatter. By the time I looked again, the feet were gone. The chain lay the way chains lie when they're not being held. I don't have a neat sequence of what happened next in me. Father Miguel came brisk as always, his running shoes quiet, his eyes taking in the triangle of candles without changing shape. He didn't cross himself. He didn't say a prayer. He looked heavy, as if he'd been hoping it would skip a year. Behind him, Ms. Klein's voice carried from the sidewalk. "Is something going on over there?" I heard Deputy Roach's car slow, the engine a low companion, and then the bells gave up their pretense of shyness and rang properly for the first time that week. Not joyful, not mournful, just insistently on a pattern I didn't recognize. The sound closed the room. The candles didn't flicker. The seam drew a little breath and there was a smell felt in the back of my throat. Old and sweet like lilies kept too long. Miguel told me to fetch the small pry bar we keep in the maintenance closet. He spoke softly and his voice had no room in it for my fear. I went. The closet light has always taken 2 clicks to settle. The metal of the bar was cold enough to make my palm ache. When I came back, he was kneeling with Andy, their hands flat on the floor like men listening to a child through a bedroom door. Rocha had stepped inside the chapel now and taken his hat off. He nodded a greeting to the priest that was different from our usual banter. "If we open," Miguel said, and he looked not at me but at some fixed point on the altar rail. "We open slowly. Whatever it is, we replace and we close and we do not, understood? We do not pull anything up we cannot put back." I don't know what authority he held in that moment to tell me what to do with my own hands on my own floor. But I accepted it like we all accepted the fog and the bells and the candles. It felt very old, that acceptance. I slipped the edge of the bar into the seam and the wood lifted in a sigh. The space beneath was not dirt right away. It was linen. The old weave of it made a texture my beam caught. The dirt lay under that, rich and black and damp enough to shine. I set the board aside carefully and ran my light along the edge. I saw what I least expected, a shallow, precise rectangle lined by old timbers, not sloppy like a hole but finished like a drawer. It had been sealed and resealed more times than anyone had recorded. Father Miguel put his hand on my forearm, a simple pressure that said enough. We could have closed it then. We should have. Andy breathed out and his breath held something like relief. The bells stopped mid-pattern and the lack of them made my ears ring with what wasn't there. Then the linen shifted. It didn't flap or move in a breeze. It lifted a little in one place as if a breath had pushed up from below. The skin at the back of my neck tightened as if gripped by small cold fingers. Miguel made a sound that I felt before I heard, a prayer spoken into his sternum more than into the room. Rocha took one involuntary step back and then stepped forward again like a man correcting himself. I don't have a heroic sentence for what I did then. I lowered the board. I put my weight on it with my palm spread the way you spread a hand to calm a child. The linen pressed down. The small lift flattened. The air chilled again. We all stood very still in a way that made time take on a shape you could count by heartbeats. Then Rocha cleared his throat and said very gently, "Padre?" It wasn't a question about theology. It was the question men ask other men when both are pretending they are not afraid. Miguel said softly, "It's the anniversary of a burial." And then he did tell us a story, but only the part he needed to. In the early days, before records were tidy, when the mission was half framed and half ruin and men came and went with more fever than sense, there had been a woman from the valley who arrived with a child who would not stop crying. The child had a sickness that made his joints ache and the whites of his eyes yellow. The mother begged for a blessing. She died that week from something that ran through the camp and took a dozen others. The boy was buried quickly because the earth runs faster than the living when fear is loose, and the priest who did the rites was too old and too new here, and he put the boy in the one place that felt very holy to him, under the floor at the place where the wooden meets the stone, where the feet of the faithful pause before they kneel. It was done in kindness and in error. Every year, around the time the fog first settles like it intends to stay, the bells misbehave, and the floor hums a little, and someone hears something like a small hand against wood. It is not every year, he said. It is often. He said it without any seasoning, like a man telling you that your hose has a slow leak and he will show you where to wrap it. He asked me to help him slide the board back into place. We did slowly, the way you return a book to a shelf when someone you love is asleep. The seam closed its mouth. The candles went out without smoke, as if they'd been pinched by someone with very clean fingers. The bells didn't sound again that night. I didn't sleep after. Andy offered me his couch and I said yes, and we lay awake not talking while his upstairs neighbor paced exactly 12 steps back and forth above us until 3. The next day the mission was bright and ordinary and full of field trips again. Lorraine scolded a child gently for chewing gum. Ms. Klein brought by a paper plate of cookies she had no doubt baked at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. Father Miguel wore different shoes that looked a little more like dress shoes. I stayed. I don't know why that surprises even me to type, but it does. I stayed because the beds needed trimming and the fountains needed scrubbing, and because the place didn't belong to the sound from beneath. It belonged to all of it. The roses, the adobe, the chalk marks on the beams, the teenagers kissing on the wall, the ropes that looked like sleeping animals. But the week has a smell now when it comes around. The fog feels like a coat I'm asked to put on. The bells mark the evening like a slow memory. Sometimes I think the dirt finds its way through the smallest cracks just to say, not in hostility but in insistence, that the earth remembers every name we give back to it. 2 nights ago I was coiling the hose by the fountain when my radio hiccuped and gave me a burst of a station from somewhere inland. Country music thin as a reed. I laughed and shook it and the sound came back to local. The chain at the south gate lifted and settled with no one there. I heard a single bell note and then another, spaced the way a child knocks because they haven't learned rhythm. I locked the chapel door twice and then a third time because sometimes your hands don't believe your eyes. I stood by the nave and listened. It was very quiet and very kind. The boards under my feet held steady. On the altar, someone had left 3 lilies that smelled like something remembered from long ago. I turned to go when something small pressed against the outside of the door at knee height, once like a greeting. I rested my palm on the wood and pressed back gently because I am a fool for anything that asks softly. You can tell me it's trick wiring or fog density or the power of suggestion, or the old sorrow of a valley that still swallows names. You can tell me I stayed too long in a place that bends its silence around you, but this is the part I'm living with. When I put my keys down at home now, sometimes one is moved in the morning, a key that only fits the chapel, and it's arranged not far away, just turned 90 degrees. Like someone curious about how shapes fit, I put it back and say out loud, as if to the radio, as if to the bells, as if to a pair of feet I can't quite see, that visiting hours are over at 9, and we try to keep the quiet clean. Then I go to work and sweep, and the seam at the floor is closed and the candles are still. And if I press my ear to the wood, I hear nothing at all except, once a year, the faintest thump from below, the sound of someone small practicing the idea of coming home. I never planned on posting this anywhere, but I can't keep playing it off like nerves or fatigue. I used to manage nerves fine. I worked nights through college, then through 2 breakups, then through that first winter my dad got sick, and a job is a job. But this keeps following me into daylight, into the grocery store, into those blank minutes before my alarm rings. Even now, months after I quit, if I close my eyes, I can feel the slant of the floor under my feet like a boat that never stops listing. Maybe telling you will pin it down. Maybe it'll just make me feel less alone with it. I worked at a tourist town bar up in the foothills, the kind with a theme they didn't need to invent because the town had actually been a gold camp in the 1800s. The place kept the original name, The Prospect, which meant summer weekends were packed with families taking photos by the swinging doors and men in tailored flannel asking if we did authentic sarsaparilla. The front room had a long mahogany bar bolted to the wall, warped mirrors behind it with silvering peeling off in islands, and an upright piano nobody touched because the keys stuck and the sound made the back of your teeth feel too big. The floor was original too. It sloped maybe a full inch down toward the street, so if you set a beer down too fast it would creep toward the lip of the bar unless you cupped it. We joked about it with customers. That's the prospects test, I'd say. If you can still reach your beer, you're not done yet. They'd laugh like I was charming and old-timey, and I'd laugh back and check their IDs. Closing was my job most nights. I'm boring that way. I like straightening stacks of menus, folding bar towels into squares, doing the drawer count with a kind of meditative precision. My manager Mike liked that about me. He's one of the good ones. Mid-40s, shaved head, always smelling faintly of laundry detergent because he actually washes the bar rags instead of letting them sit in bleach water until they turn into soup. He trusted me with the register and the safe. My coworker Jess was the opposite of me in most ways. She did improv on weekends, dyed her hair a different color every few months, and knew all the regulars' dogs' names but could never remember their owners. But on busy nights, we moved around each other like we'd been doing it forever. We split tips and took turns walking each other to our cars. After midnight, the town went from kitsch to quiet. I used to like the quiet. Every place has a story it tells about itself. The Prospect's story was the usual. A gambler shot on the steps during a game. A girl in a blue dress who fell from the balcony when the boards were slick with spilled beer. A miner who hid gold dust in the piano soundboard and then died before he could retrieve it. People would ask, leaning over the bar like they were confiding in me, "So is it haunted?" I'd smile and say, "If it is, they tip in coins." They always liked that line. And then, one night, the register gave me an answer I didn't want. It was slow. November, dark by 5. The last of the leaf peepers had left and we were running a weeknight schedule. By 11:30 there were 3 guys left. A contractor who always paid in 20s and 2 seasonal workers with sawdust still in their hair. Jess cut the music. The guys finished up and headed out with quiet goodnights that hung in the cold air coming through the door. I wiped down the bar like I always do. Hot water, a little vinegar, thin circles until you can feel the wood again. Mike counted out drawer 1 while I got the glass washer drained. We have 2 drawers at the Prospect, and our system is old school. You end the night with a tally sheet, bills stacked by denomination, coins scooped into a plastic dish. Drawer 2 is always light on quarters because tourists keep them for the stamp machine by the front door. I'm telling you all this because the details matter. They're the part that makes me think I'm not just remembering wrong. We shut the door at midnight exactly. Deadbolt clicked. Closed sign flipped. The neon beer sign hummed itself into a quieter brightness. Mike grabbed his jacket and said he'd be in the office for 5 minutes to finish the vendor email. Jess took out the trash and started a text fight with her boyfriend. I stood behind the bar with a towel over my shoulder and stacked clean pint glasses. The mirrors threw up 4 of me, 5 if I leaned. The borders of the old silvering had always made it look like a map of islands with dark water between. Sometimes when we were fooling around, Jess would line up a shot so the mirrors split her into 3 versions, one smiling, one neutral, one frowning. She called them past, present, and next shift Jess. I don't know why I remembered that just then. Maybe because I was alone in front of them. The register clicked, not a full open, just the hitch of the spring. I looked down. The drawer sat flush like it should. I checked the tally under my fingertips. Everything was accounted for, including one Sacagawea dollar that a kid had insisted on paying with for his root beer. When you close enough, you get familiar with the sounds a register can make. This was not one of those sounds. It was like someone hung their fingers on the lip and let the metal edge fall back into place. I reached out, pulled it open halfway, and closed it myself, just to be sure the latch wasn't loose. Solid click. I wiped my hands on my jeans and told myself I'd mention it to Mike. That was when the coin dropped. It didn't fall far. It didn't clatter. It landed with that small, purposeful weight you hear when someone drops a coin onto wood with meaning. I looked at the bar top. A dime sat on the wood where it had been empty a second ago. I know because I had wiped that exact spot just minutes before, watching the towel catch splinters in the grain. The dime was old. I could see the torch and olive branch, but the edges were worn pale. I picked it up and felt the faint grease of skin. If I let myself, I could have told you it felt warm. I didn't let myself. I put it in the plastic dish and told the air, "We're closed." My voice sounded normal. Jess came back from the alley, breath fogging, fingers cold from the trash bin. "Did you hear that?" she said, head tilted. It sounded like the piano. The piano hadn't been touched since a wedding party in July when a groomsman had pounded out something that turned into yelling. We'd put the cover back and slid the bench under. I said I hadn't heard it. I don't lie often, but it felt like the right move. Jess shrugged, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and kissed the air by my cheek as she headed out the door. "You good? Need me to wait?" she asked. I said no because Mike was still here. She waved through the window and disappeared into the bleed of streetlights on damp asphalt. I did one last pass with the towel. A square of everything was done. The warp of the mirror made it look like the bottles were leaning forward to hear a secret. That's when I saw the wet ring. It was small and exact, a circle the size of a rocks glass. That would have made sense if we'd had anyone at the bar in the last 15 minutes who'd ordered whiskey. But the last drink I'd poured was a craft IPA for the contractor in a tall glass, and I had wiped the bar after he left. I know because I have a habit of dragging the towel off the edge at the very end, watching the water fall into the bus bin. It's a stupid little ritual that means done, but there it was, a clear, wet loop like someone had lifted their glass and walked away. I put my hand an inch above it. The air over wet wood is cooler. This was room temperature, nothing strange. The ring stayed even as I watched it. I looked at the mirror. For a split second, I thought there was a second ring in the glass, an echo of the first. I stepped closer, and the silvering shifted my face into more faces. It was just me in a circle of water and the hum of the beer sign and the soft click of Mike typing in back. I wiped it. The towel took the ring off cleanly. I started toward the light switch, then stopped and turned back. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that cleanup stayed done. I looked in the mirror again, expecting to see only the dim bar and my stupid, cautious face. There were 3 people still sitting at the bar, reflected exactly where no one sat. I didn't register details right away. The brain stalls. It adds and subtracts until things feel familiar. I think this is why you hear about people calmly petting a mountain lion, because they thought it was a big dog. My first thought was that I was seeing the reflection of the framed photos on the opposite wall. Black and white shots of miners and a group of women in long dresses smiling like they had a secret. But the angle was wrong. These were not photographs. These were figures where our wiped bar should have been. One was a woman, hair-pinned neat. The kind of neat that tells you she cares about being proper even at midnight. One was a man with his shoulders turned slightly away from the mirror, as if saving his face for someone else. The third was thinner, younger maybe, elbow tucked in like he didn't want to take up space. All 3 were looking not at each other, but toward the point where the register would be if you drew a line backward from the mirror, which meant they were looking at me. I turned around so fast I dropped the towel. There was no one. Stools pushed in. The piano closed. The door locked with the sign flipped. I was alone in the bar. The mirror still had its 3 watchers, and my chest had that awful empty feeling like when your phone falls between the car seat and the console. I looked back at them. The man had his hand on the bar like he'd just taken his fingers off a coin. I don't remember making a decision. I just walked backward toward the office without turning my back on the mirror. The office door was half shut, warm fluorescent light seeping under it. I pushed it open and said, "Mike." He was there, eyes on the monitor, typing an email to the distributor about the IPA that came in skunky. He looked up and said, "1 sec." I said, "There are people." And I felt stupid because what people would be in a locked bar? He stood up and followed me out, rubbing at the back of his neck like he always did when a keg coupler gave him trouble. We stood together in front of the mirror. There was only us and 100 bottles and the slap of neon on glass. He squinted. "You okay?" he asked. I said I must have been seeing the photos reflected. "We can rearrange those," he offered, half kidding. He's that kind of manager. He doesn't make you feel like you're making him rearrange the world. "It's fine," I said. "I'm tired." We locked up the safe and walked out together under streetlights that buzzed like wasps turning in their sleep. The air smelled like pine and cold iron. He waited until I got into my car and I did the same for him. I didn't sleep much that night. When I did, I woke with my own face split into 3 in my head. I told myself it was stress, that I was primed to see something, that we all read the same stories about the same bars and the same ghosts. People tell you their experiences because they hope you'll tell them yours. That's how stories spread, the harmless kind, and I guess the other kind too. The next day, Jess came in with her hair dyed a deep green that should have looked like a cartoon but somehow looked expensive. "I told my mom about the piano thing," she said while tying on her apron. "She sent holy water." She held up a tiny bottle with a blue label from the Catholic store next to the laundromat. "You're not Catholic," I said. "Does it have a warranty?" She dabbed a little on the bar and made the cross. We laughed until we didn't, then we went back to work. For a week, the strange things were small enough to fold into routines. The register would Coke bottle hiccup and then behave. A single coin, a nickel, then a penny, then a quarter, would appear on the wood in the same spot. I started putting them in a separate glass, and when the glass had 5 coins, I walked them back to the safe like they were something private. We keep the cameras running during open hours, and when we close, we set the alarm and the motion sensor. Twice the alarm company called at 2 a.m. for movement in the front room. The police came out the first time. Deputy Orr, the one with the mustache you could trust with your spare house key, let himself in and found nothing but the draft that comes through the old door when the wind is right. The second time I went in with Mike, because the cops were busy with a car off the highway in the rain. We opened the door and the air felt like a church just after service ends, warm in places and oddly hollow in others. The camera footage showed a weird strobe across the mirror, like headlights flickering. But there were no headlights at that hour except ours. If you had asked me then what I believed, I would have told you I believed in routines and keeping promises. People say they don't want to spook themselves. Mostly I think we don't want to be the kind of person who gets spooked. But there was the wet ring again, and again always after the last customer had gone and while we were doing the closing dance. One night I put a coaster over the spot just to see. The ring didn't appear. On the mirror, the silvering had a faint new bloom along the bottom edge, the kind you get when moisture creeps behind glass. I told myself I'd mention a dehumidifier to Mike. I told myself it would be smart to leave the lights brighter for a week, so the old walls wouldn't feel like a throat closing. The night it broke open, there was a fundraiser in the back room for the Historical Society, the kind of event where everyone knows each other and claps too long for the same speech about preserving heritage. The bartender back there, Marco, had a flow that made people think the drink made itself in his hands. The front room felt like the quiet end of a party you're not invited to. Jess worked the floor and I took the bar. At 10:30 we got a brief rush. A couple from Sacramento who wanted to know if we could make a Ramos gin fizz. We could not. A pair of trail hikers with dirt still on their shoes. A man with a soft voice and a cold index finger. When he touched the counter to get my attention, he ordered a seltzer with lime and then didn't touch it. That's another detail I keep trying not to read into, but it's there. He watched the mirror more than he watched me. When the room thinned, he slipped me a tip in the shape of a single silver dollar. I put it in the glass with the others before I thought it through. We closed late because the fundraiser folks stayed until almost midnight, hugging and promising to volunteer for the parade and the cemetery cleanup day. After the last goodbye, the building exhaled. Jess started the dishwasher and I rediscovered all the small rings and crumbs people leave behind to prove they were real. Mike went to the office. The piano made one note by itself, a damped too-soft G that sounded like someone pressing with the pad of a finger. I called out without thinking, "Not tonight." And the quiet that followed had texture like velvet rubbed the wrong way. The register opened a half-inch. I pushed it closed. The mirror blinked, not with light exactly, but with a sense of the room settling into a different shape. It's the same moment you get when a power outage clears and your house suddenly seems audible to itself. In the warped glass, there were the three again, exactly like before if you don't count the way the woman's head was turned now, like she'd been willing to wait until I looked back to be fully present. Her hair was pinned with something bright, but brightness in those old mirrors always looks contaminated, like light that's been passed through too many hands. I stood with the towel hanging from my fingers and looked straight at them. I could finally see details. The man's shirt collar a little frayed, a tie knotted twice like he wanted it to hold. The young one's jacket shoulders too wide. The woman's hands folded, jaw tense with the effort of being steady. In the mirror, that old piano had its top open. In real life, it was closed. "Mike," I said, not turning. "Do me a favor and stand next to me." He came and stood there, breath warm, shoulder a comfort near mine without touching. "What do you see?" I asked. We watched the mirror together. A long heartbeat passed. "Just us," he said. He wasn't placating me. He would have humored me with better subtlety. He looked at the bar itself. "Want me to go get ore?" he asked, only half kidding. "If someone broke in through the mirror, we can charge them double." He squeezed my shoulder. The squeeze was the sign. Mike never touches without asking. He did then because I think he felt me shake. He went back to the office. I should have gone with him. I didn't. I put a coaster over the place where the wet ring always formed. I think I wanted to see if that changed anything. The mirror's three didn't change. The young one lifted his elbow like he was about to make space. The man set down his hand. The woman's lips moved a fraction, and they were not turned toward the mirror anymore. They were turned toward me. I felt the draft from the door as if someone had opened it, but I could hear the deadbolt sit where it was. I could list the smells. Lemon cleaner, old wood, the faintest breath of cigar from some jacket that had leaned too close. And under it, something green like juniper crushed in a fist. My phone buzzed in my back pocket, Jess texting me a meme from the alley where she was smoking. I pulled the phone out without taking my eyes off the mirror, and with a dumb impulse I can't explain, I opened the camera and held it up. I aimed it at the mirror. The screen showed the bar, the bottles, me and Jess coming back in through the swing door, hair haloed in the neon beer light. That was all. 3 figures not there. I switched to video and hit record anyway. I angled my wrist so the reflection of my camera showed a tiny phone in a tiny mirror, like an echo into distance. The woman's mouth was moving. My phone recorded a clean nothing. Jess came up beside me, followed my gaze, and said, "Nope." She did not ask me what I was looking at, which is one of the things I liked about her. She slid her hand into mine. Her palm was cold from outside, and her nails were painted the same green as her hair. "If I see anything at all, I'm clocking out," she said, voice conversational. "I'm not built for this, and I make peace with my limits." I laughed, but it came out wrong. The mirror looked like it was breathing. Not moving, breathing. The skinned silver edge clouded once, then cleared like a window touched by a mouth. I didn't ask permission. I spoke toward the glass and said, "What do you want?" It's ridiculous in the face of anything real, but it's the only question you can ask when you're out of all the practical ones. The mirror offered me back a version of my own face I didn't recognize. Paler, tired, eyes too bright. The woman in the mirror blinked. And then with a sound like a coin set down on wood, something knocked under the bar. Not inside the cabinets, not on the front panel, down in the space between the floor and the bottom of the bar where the toe kick is cut away. It was a patient sound. I knelt, ignoring Jess hissing my name like I was moving toward a cliff. There's a panel down there with a little gap where the wood doesn't quite meet flush. I've dropped bottle caps that rolled under and had to fish them back with a ruler. I got on my knees and felt around until the pads of my fingers touched it. The board shifted a fraction. I levered it forward and light from the bar fell into a shallow cavity about 12 inches deep, maybe 4 inches high, wide enough to run the length of the bar. A place to hide things so that nobody sitting on a stool would see if you took them out. I reached into that dark with one hand while keeping my eyes on the mirror. The figures didn't move, but the air did, cool and dank like something kept shut too long. My fingers touched fabric. I pinched and pulled. It was a roll, old lapseam edge knotted with dirty twine. I lowered it to the floor. The twine had rotted enough that one tug opened it and silver spilled out. A handful of old coins and 2 small round metal tokens stamped with a star. "Look," I said to Jess, "because that's what you do when you want someone to confirm the world with you." She let out a breath. "Okay," she said, sounding like someone stepping into cold water. "Okay." I reached back into the cavity and my hand found paper, stiff, stuck to itself. I eased it out, flaking. A ledger page, brown with age, neat columns in ink that had bled. Names, amounts. 2 words at the top in a clerk's hand. House tabs, the date, June 14th, 1902. Behind us, the register opened entirely like a mouth. The spring screamed soft. Jess yelped. I set the paper on the bar, and for the second it took my eyes off the mirror. The 3 figures were no longer where they had been. When I looked back, the mirror held only me and Jess in a room that had decided to be what it had always been. My phone in my hand stopped recording. The file saved with a meaningless date and timestamp, a little red dot in the corner. The register settled into quiet. Somewhere in the walls, the building sighed. Jess grabbed my wrist. "We are leaving," she said. "We are going to make Mike lock this from the office, and we are going to go home and not discuss whether it gets weird when we think about it in the shower." We did exactly that. We stacked the coins in a glass, slid the panel back with more force than it needed, left the ledger page on top of the bar like a coaster, and locked the door with our breathing too loud in the air. Mike watched our faces tell him the story without words. He stayed calmer than I felt and said, "Tomorrow," like it was a spell. He said he wanted to call the Historical Society because that'd make a good headline and because maybe they'd know if it was legal to keep things found in a wall that belonged to a building nobody can prove ownership of before. 1920. I drove home on roads that felt an inch off in a way I couldn't fix by blinking. The next day we came in early. Mike had printed out a sign for the door with a neat little apology about a private event. He held a coffee in each hand, just like he did when he needed both hands to be busy. The ledger wasn't on the bar. The glass with the coins wasn't there either. The panel under the bar slid out like it had never caught on anything in its life. The cavity was empty except for dust that looked new. Jess looked at me and then at Mike like she'd promised herself she wouldn't look at anyone that way. He went straight to the safe, opened it, and took out the glass with the coins, which he'd put there because he wasn't an idiot. It had 3 coins, not the handful we'd found. "Did you move the ledger?" he asked me. I shook my head. Jess shook hers. The door was still locked from the inside, the alarm light still red from the night before. The cameras showed the office door and the hallway in the front room. No one had gone in or out. No one had stood at the bar. At 2:13 a.m., the mirror flickered like water and then went blank. We called the Historical Society anyway. A woman named Darla came, whose family had worked at the Prospect in the 70s. She wore a sweater with little pine trees knitted into it and had a key to the tiny museum up the road. She listened to our story without interruption and then asked if she could see behind the mirror. The mirror doesn't come down easily. It's bolted and framed and honestly feels like it holds half the wall together. She stood in front of it and tilted her head. When she went to leave, she put a dime on the bar like a joke to break the tension. "On the house," she said, and then paused like the words tasted not kidding as soon as they were out. After that, we tried not to feed it. We didn't talk about the mirror to customers. We didn't press on the floorboards where the slant is worst. We didn't lift the panel again. For a while, it seemed to work. The wet ring didn't appear. The register behaved. At close, I'd feel something like I was forgetting to blow out a candle. But I'd check and the bar would be dark and the scent of citrus would be the last thing left. I lasted another month. Then a Tuesday rolled around. The kind that's too quiet to make you feel like a person on a stage nobody showed up for. A rain had started that afternoon and made the street smell like wet pennies. The few customers we had left early. I wiped the wood and counted the till and walked Jess out. Her car started on the first try for once. I went back in and turned off the neon sign. The mirror gave me back a version of the room I could live with. I put my hand on the register, felt the cool of the metal lid, the shape of my own palm. I stood there longer than I needed to, and on a thought I can't justify, I slid the panel out again. The cavity was empty. It wasn't any more empty than the usual empty of old spaces. It was the kind of empty that feels like a story has been moved somewhere else. I put the panel back. I washed my hands. I picked up my keys. I walked to the door and looked through the glass to the street. The reflection of the bar was faint behind me. 3 people sat at the bar in the mirror, motionless, looking past me toward the register. The woman was still. The man's hand rested on the bar. The young one looked like a shadow on a shadow. I turned around and there was only wood and glass and night. I looked through the window again, and for the first time it felt like they could see me seeing them. Their looks were not pleading. They weren't angry. They were the looks of people who expect the world to do what it has always done. Hold the coin, note the tab, open the drawer, and wait for the change. I quit the next day, citing family stuff and the drive and how final stress never really leaves you. Mike didn't argue, which made it worse. Jess hugged me and slipped a dime into my pocket as a joke. Except the dime was old and worn smooth on one side. I moved 2 towns over and took a morning shift at a place with mirrors so new they still had stickers on the corners. I close now only when I absolutely have to. If I drop a coin and it rolls, I let it go and find it in daylight. Sometimes the dreams still shift on their axis. Sometimes I wake and my bedroom is 3 inches shorter, and the light under my door is the color of beer signs. Twice I've found a wet ring on my kitchen table even though I drink out of mugs there. And once my phone recorded 6 seconds of nothing, with a little scratch at the end like a pencil marking a ledger. If I drive through town and the prospect is in my path, I take the long way. But once, okay, not once, 3 times, I've driven slowly past and looked through the window the way you look at your old house when you're too proud to admit you want to see if someone painted it. The glass shows 3 people at the bar every time, motionless, looking straight at me through the street and the slant of the floor and the story the place tells about itself. If I park and get out, if I walk up and put my hand to the glass, maybe I'll see them turn. Maybe they already have, and I'm just seeing the echo, the way a mirror remembers who you were even after you move. I don't go inside. I don't have a good ending. I only have this and the coin in my coat pocket I didn't put there, smooth as a promise and as heavy as one too. I'm not the kind of person who writes stories online, but I can't sleep lately. And talking to my sister about this just made her more worried, so I'm putting it here. Maybe someone will tell me I imagined it, or that there's a reasonable explanation. I want there to be one. I worked as a night security guard at a brand new office in Silicon Valley, the kind with a lobby that smells like eucalyptus and money, where the espresso machine has a startup logo, and the bathrooms have nicer hand soap than my apartment. We were told the building sat on the lot where an old machine shop burned down in the 80s. The developer had done the full raise and rebuild, dug the foundation deep for a VR demo lab in the basement, then a server room, a media studio, the whole future-looking spread. Certified LEED Platinum, my supervisor told me. These walls practically breathe. After midnight, when the building was just me and the janitorial crew and the hum of the air handlers, I swear it felt like the walls were holding their breath. I took the job because nights keep me steady. There's a rhythm to it. Badge in at 10:45, log the handover from the day guard. Walk the interior loop, 13 floors, stairs going up, elevator coming down because you don't trust your heart on the stairs at 3 in the morning. Coffee, black, in a paper cup that gets soft at the rim if you take too long. Watch the lobby cameras. Try not to get sucked into Reddit rabbit holes. Push through the slow hours between 2 and 4, when your brain makes a soft give-up noise and the buzzing lights seem to sink half an inch lower. Then sunrise punches through the glass atrium like a rescue team and you think, okay, another one. See you tonight. I wasn't alone all the time. Miguel worked the shift before mine a couple nights a week and sometimes stayed late to talk basketball or trade ghost stories about other accounts. He's the one who told me about the fire, leaning on the dispatch desk with a bag of chips he never offered. Guy next door says the old owner used to run the lathes after hours. Illegal contracts, cheap labor. One night somebody left a torch on or a rag caught. Boom. Whole place lit up like a candle. He made a little blossom with his hand. They found the owner in a corner by the tool cage, sooted to hell, still holding a wrench like it could fix a fire. Miguel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Anyway, we've got better sprinklers. Our supervisor was Priya. She was precise in a way that made you want to do things right. She called everybody sir and ma'am, even when they were interns in hoodies. On my second week, she told me the basement motion detectors had been chatty on overnights. Could be the HVAC settling into its automation routines, she said. Could be a raccoon found a way into the ductwork. Her mouth did a small, neat smile. Could be bad calibration. I've scheduled maintenance. In the meantime, radio anything unusual. Don't be a hero. I told her I didn't plan to be. That was true for a while. The first time the basement cameras tripped, it was raining. The kind of February rain where the 101 turns into a ribbon of spray, and the lobby glass is a black mirror with cigarette burns for streetlights. I was nursing my coffee and watching the night janitor, Rosa, push her cart into the elevator. She always hummed old songs and wore a plastic rain bonnet even indoors. I liked her. She made the building feel like it belonged to people. The console chirped and the screen for B2 went gray for half a second, then came back. I toggled the view. The tool cage down there is a joke. This is a tech company, so tools means VR headsets and Pelican cases and a couple carbon fiber tripods. The cage was closed and neatly labeled like everything else. The hallway outside looked empty. I made a note, took a sip, and felt it. A smell that didn't belong. Not garbage, not mildew. Hot metal. That old summer smell when the toaster overheats and the cord gets that plastic tang. It threaded through the lobby like a thought you're not ready to have. I stood up, told myself I was doing it for the insurance paperwork later, and took the elevator down with my badge pressed to my chest so it wouldn't swing and clack. The doors opened to the basement hall, white and too bright. The sound of the air handlers like faraway surf. I walked past the glass-fronted server room. You can see the blue LEDs in neat rows in there, blinking like a city after midnight. I stood for a second, waiting for the smell to be louder, but all I heard was this tiny clicking like a cooling engine. No one else in sight. I finished the loop and came back up. The console didn't chirp again. Miguel laughed when I told him the next day. New buildings like to sing when their guts settle. It's like an old guitar. He tapped the desk in time with some invisible beat, then shrugged. Or maybe your sprinkler certification is trash. Check the gauges. The event stayed small for a few weeks. The B2 camera would hiccup, show grainy static in a thin band, then resolve. Once, the static made a blocky shape near the tool cage. Just for a breath, almost like a figure. But when I rewound the feed frame by frame, it was nothing. Just the digital mush you get when a camera tries to guess what you want it to see. Another night, the elevator took me to the basement when I'd pressed the lobby, and I had this prickly feeling that someone had been standing just to the left of the doors, out of sight, close enough that I could smell wet fabric. I told myself it was the mop bucket. Rosa stopped humming in the halls and started humming only in the elevator. I asked her if everything was okay, and she smiled, a shy twist. Downstairs is too cold now, she said, even when the thermostat is high. She tapped her elbow with 2 fingers, meaning the ache that comes with damp. And I smell smoke sometimes. I wanted to say me too, but the words felt childish, like saying the dark was heavy. Priya scheduled a service vendor to run diagnostics. A guy named Arjun with perfect hair showed up at midnight with a rolling case full of laptops and meters. He plugged into the network closet and watched numbers dance for 2 hours, then came to the lobby with a neat report. Cameras are fine, he said. Basement sensors run at a different ground than the main floors. Sometimes you get noise. We can tune it. He looked at me like he was trying to calibrate my expression. You're seeing static, yes? He made a rectangle in the air. Looks like shapes sometimes. Faces even. But only for a moment. It's a known artifact. We get calls. Your brain fills it in. He smiled like he had solved it. I wanted to believe him. That night, the server room smelled sharper, a mix of hot copper and something sweet the way old smoke gets when it has nowhere to go. I stood at the glass and watched my reflection breathe. It looked pale and tired in that clinical light. Then it did something I still don't know how to put into words without sounding like I'm making a myth. It blinked at the wrong time. I blinked. The reflection waited. Then it blinked. The delay was a fraction, a hiccup. I told myself the glass was coated, a half-second of latency and some kind of energy-saving tint. I lifted my hand and let it hover. The reflection lifted its hand a hair late. I laughed out loud, too loudly for the quiet hall, and walked away because if you stay too long and test it, You become the test. On a Tuesday, Officer Lin came by on his rounds. He covers a loop of these new campuses at night, scanning a QR code in our lobby to prove to his sergeant he actually stopped. He's the kind of cop who knows your birthday after you tell him once. He asked if I was sleeping and I said not great, and he nodded toward the cameras. Basements are liars, he said. They say nobody's there when they're full of air movement and echoes. You get crosstalk. He patted my forearm once, gentle. But if you smell something, call the fire department. Don't wait. 2 nights later, it went from nuisance to wrong. The console didn't just chirp, it screamed. The kind of alarm that bypasses your ears and tells your bones to move. B2 motion. B2 door. B2's interior. B2 tool cage. The hallway feeds showed me nothing and everything at once. Static in shimmering bands, then clarity, then a smear like a heat haze. I grabbed the radio and told Rosa to stay with people, then realized there were no people and the only people were me and Rosa, and she wasn't in the basement. She was in the lobby bathroom, judging by the cart. I told her to stay in the lobby anyway and locked the front doors from the console, heart thudding like I'd sprinted. I took the elevator down because the stairs felt like a mouth and I didn't want to be inside it. When the doors opened, the smell hit me like a memory you try to swallow. Hot metal, old smoke, a faint sweetness like burned varnish. It was colder than it should have been. I could see my breath. That didn't make physical sense. I walked toward the server room and the glass was fogged from the inside. Little halos around each LED like the room was sweating light. The corridor beyond the tool cage was darker than usual, like the bulbs had decided to go dim in sympathy. I told the radio I was at B2. It squelched and echoed me back with a half-second delay that made my skin crawl. At B2, my voice said, a beat late, tinny and thinner, like me without the me in it. I took the flashlight from my belt and it made a clean cone on the floor. Dust motes sparkled in a way that said this air wasn't moving right. I walked past the server room and the reflection came with me, and when I caught it at the edge of my eye, it wasn't a single thing but 2, layered, like someone had copied me and moved the copy a hair to the right. I resisted the need to test it. If I stopped, I would stop forever. The tool cage door was closed. The lock light was green. I clicked it open and stepped in because that's what my training says. You verify physically. You don't trust your eyes in low light. The smell intensified, and under it was another scent, thinner and more human. Sweat soaked into fabric a long time ago, dried, then damp again. On the workbench was a neat row of cases with VR logos and a folded microfiber cloth. In the corner, a shadow stood where there should have been a stack of boxes. I lifted the flashlight and the shadow resolved into a floor fan, unplugged, wrapped in plastic. I told myself congratulations for startling at wrapped plastic. Then something tapped against the chain link, 3 slow taps not near my hand. I spun, the taps didn't echo in the right way. They folded into the air. I backed out and relatched the door because if I left it open, Priya would have a note for me. And the thought of a note felt like the only hard, normal thing in the world. I turned to go and a man walked through the server room's closed steel door. He didn't open it. He was just inside the glass and then he was not inside the glass. He wore a uniform with the kind of patch you get from a supply house. White letters you buy in bulk and stick on like names. He was covered in soot down one side like a shadow had fallen and stayed. He held something in his right hand at a downward angle, and my brain said wrench before I had time to try for another word. He didn't look at me. He looked down the hall like he was late for a shift. Then he was gone as if someone had cut the film and glued it back wrong. I did not run. My trainer would be proud. I walked with purpose to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there like an idiot, making bargains with a metal door. The elevator hummed up somewhere else, indifferent. The lights went a shade warmer, then cooler, like clouds passing the sun, but there's no sun down there. I took the stairs because suddenly the stairs were the only honest thing, even if they were a mouth. I jogged 2 flights, came out in the lobby with my breath loud in my throat, and the smell came with me and I understood that it wasn't the building, it was me. It stuck to my coat and tongue. Rosa was at the desk with her hands around a paper cup that wasn't hers. Fire? She asked, ready to move. I said I didn't know. We stood together and listened to the top of the world silence these places have at night, when the free snack drawers are asleep and the kombucha taps stop pretending to be beer. Priya answered on the second ring. She always answers. I told her what I'd seen and heard everything wrong coming out of my mouth because there's no way to say a man walked through steel and have it land. There was a pause long enough that I thought the line had died. Then she said, "Careful. We're going to call maintenance and the fire department for a check. Prop the front doors. Get fresh air in. Log everything." Her voice softened just barely. "You did the right thing." She said she was on her way. The fire crew rolled in with quiet efficiency. 2 engines and a battalion SUV because this building is expensive, and the city would prefer it not to burn. They took a thermal camera downstairs and came back with puzzled shrugs. "Significant cold spots," the captain said. "Negative temps near the server room glass. Weird convection like the air's falling when it should rise." He looked at the gauges, at me, at the ceiling. "No source. Your electrical panels are clean. No CO. Sprinklers show pressure." He closed his book. "Call us again if it trips, seriously, even if you think it's nothing." I thought that would be the climax. The official visit, the shrug, the weird note. It wasn't. The building waited until the next rain, the week after, when the air outside felt like wet tissue and the lobby's eucalyptus smell turned to something like menthol in a sick room. It was a Sunday overnight and there was no janitor, budget thing, so it was just me and the beige hum. Around 2 a.m., every camera feed in the basement went from normal to static in one sweep. Like someone had run a comb through the air. The alarm didn't scream this time. It made a small sound like a voice clearing. The static resolved into patterns, into crosshatch, into something that looked like shuttered windows. Then something else. The shapes were wrong for a second, too narrow or too thick, then they made sense. Doorways. The tool cage camera showed a doorway where there is no doorway. A rectangle darker than the dark it sat in. And a figure in that rectangle like a smudge pressed against glass from the other side. I knew better. I still went down. The elevator didn't stop at B2, it went to B3, there is no B3. The light ticked over anyway, polite. The doors opened to the same hallway, but wrong. The floor was damp in a way that didn't leave footprints. The smell was stronger, metallic and sweet. The server room glass was opaque with breath. The lights were steady, but they felt like they were struggling. Like they had to push through syrup to be light. I took a step and the radio hissed in a voice that was mine but not said. "Don't." Half a beat after I'd already taken the step. Something knocked 3 times on the other side of the server room door. Slow and deliberate with the weight of a handheld tool. The sound was distinct, steel against steel, softened by a hand. I told myself I'd open the door and solve whatever stupid mechanical issue was making the universe tilt. I badged the access panel. The light stayed red. I badged it again. The light flushed green, then went a dusty yellow I've never seen on a reader before and hoped to never see again. The door opened an inch and stopped like someone on the other side was resting their foot against it. I pushed. I'm not big, but adrenaline makes you believe you could shoulder through a train. The gap widened to 2 inches, then 3. Cold rolled across my hands and made them ache. I peered into the slit and saw the row of racks, the neat wires, a smear on the floor like someone had dragged a wet rag in a half circle. The smell of thermal paste and old smoke stacked together until my eyes watered. Then the door pushed back hard before I could remove my hand. It didn't slam. It closed the way a tired person closes a door to keep in the heat. I stumbled away and the reader light went flat green like it was making fun of me. When I turned, the hallway that should go straight to the tool cage was shorter. It ended in a blank wall 5 paces sooner than it should have. I took those paces because your brain says if you touch it, you'll make sense of it. The wall was real. Cold. Condensation beaded in a running pattern like tear tracks. I wiped it with my sleeve. Under the moisture, the paint was new. I pressed my ear to it and heard nothing. Then a soft rhythmic thumping. Not a knock this time, but like something alive moving the only way it could. It was slow and patient. I stepped back because stepping back was all I had. The wall was still a wall. The radio whispered my name out of static. Then a second voice quietly said my name the way my sister does, like a caution. I have never been that cold standing up. I don't remember deciding to leave. I remember the stairs. I remember the elevator humming in a stuttering way like a person trying not to cry. In the lobby, the eucalyptus smell had retreated and the air was damp. I propped the doors wide, put the door wedges in like the captain had liked, and stood on the sidewalk with the rain kissing my face until I could feel my fingers again. The building looked normal in that way. Expensive things do. Indifferent and well lit. On the street across, a rideshare driver idled and watched me through wipers that worked too hard. Priya arrived faster than makes sense unless she was already on her way. She took one look at me and said, "Okay," in a voice that made my shoulders drop. We went inside together, not because it felt safer, but because being alone had begun to feel like a mistake that taught other mistakes how to happen. We went down. The elevator obeyed the buttons like a well-paid servant. B2 lit. The doors opened to the white hallway I knew, long and intact. The server room glass was clear. The tool cage was where the blueprint said it was. The wall was not a wall. It was a hallway extending like a stage set. My sleeve was damp, but from the rain. The reader lights were green in the boring way lights are when nothing is wrong. We walked the loop. It was fine until it wasn't. At the far corner where the concrete meets a mechanical chase, the smell pooled and the air bent light. The thermal camera from the fire department would have shown you a hole in blue. We stood there. I tried to describe what I'd seen. Priya listened like paperwork was holy, which is her way of making things worth taking seriously. When we came back to the lobby, she typed a field report with my words in it and didn't correct much. I signed it. She slid me a cup of coffee and said without looking at me, "If you need to switch sites, I'll make it happen." I told her I was fine because saying yes would have made the fear feel permanent. That was stupid. She nodded like she knew it was stupid and would let me be stupid until I wasn't. 2 days later, Rosa told me she'd put in for a transfer back to the clinic building she used to clean. "Too many reflections here," she said gently, like she was apologizing for a superstition. Officer Lin started scanning our QR code from the sidewalk. He said the rain was making his knees ache and smiled too hard. Miguel stopped staying late. "You look like you're seeing your own ghost," he said, and then made a joke about my diet I can't remember. The last night I worked there, I started the shift with a plan. Ride the hours like a wave. Count small victories, no alarms, no smells, no reflections breaking rank, and then tell Priya I'd take that transfer. By midnight, the building agreed with my plan. The cameras were calm. The lobby lights hummed a normal hum. I read a long article about a guy who tried to live in an airport secretly for months and failed on day one. Around 3, you always get this hollow time, and that's when the basement feeds played back footage of me sitting at the lobby desk. It was me, same shirt, same cup of coffee, same stupid habit of tapping the lid with my nail. But the timestamp was 2 minutes ahead. I watched myself stand and rub my eyes. 2 minutes later, I did. I watched myself change the camera view. 2 minutes later, I did. I watched myself get up and take the elevator down. I did not get up. The me on the screen smiled a small, private smile I don't know how to do. He stood, took his flashlight, and walked calmly to the elevator. My mouth went dry. I sat very still. I told the radio as softly as I could, "Lobby to lobby." The radio whispered back, "Lobby to lobby," in my voice 2 seconds later, easy, like a friend repeating a joke. I did not want to know what my reflection would do, but there's a part of you that wants to see your own hand in the bear trap. I stood up and angled the screen so I could see both it and the elevator bay. The elevator arrived with a droll ding. The doors opened to emptiness. The me on the screen stepped in and turned to face the camera, and there was this small black smudge on his jaw like soot you forgot to wipe. He flicked his wrist in that way I do when I dismiss a thought. The doors closed. The screen me went down. The real elevator stayed open like it wanted me to feel stupid for expecting parody. The camera switched to B2. It showed me stepping out into the bright hallway and walking toward the server room. I stood in the lobby and listened to my heart and felt like a room missing a window. On the screen, the me in the basement raised his hand to the server room door, and when he did, the entire camera feed bloomed with white for a single frame. And in that frame, I saw not me but a man in a soot-covered uniform turning with a wrench angled down. Not looking at the camera but past it at someone behind. The bloom collapsed. The screen went black. Then grainy. Then normal. Empty hall. No one in that corridor. No me anywhere. I took the stairs down because if there were 2 of me, I would at least be the one who didn't ride the mouth of the building. B2 was bright and boring. There was nobody there. The server room glass showed rows of blinking blue and a reflection of me that blinked when I did, in time like a good mirror. The reader light was a patient green. I put my hand on the glass and felt it cold and steady like a public face. My radio hissed once and then said my name in a voice that sounded like mine after a long cry. I walked backward for 3 paces without deciding to. Then I turned and went up and wrote my resignation on company letterhead with a pen that skipped. I told Priya in person. She didn't argue. She handed me an envelope with the site transfer paperwork already printed, which was her way of letting me quit, without the shame of saying the word. "Please text when you get home," she said, and I said I would. Miguel slapped my shoulder and said he'd see me at the old office by the water where the worst thing is seagulls. Rosa hugged me like a mom. Officer Lynn told me to get a dash cam because everybody should have one, and I promised I would. It's been 3 weeks. I sleep better in that loose way you do when the bad thing is a few streets away. I don't work nights anymore. I do daytime at a smaller building where the lobby is carpeted and smells like coffee grounds and printer toner. And the only thing in the basement is a HVAC unit so old it groans like a bed. I still wake up at 2 some nights and listen for a door to breathe. Sometimes I dream the elevator moves without asking and the doors open to a hallway that ends short with a damp new wall. In the morning I tell my sister over the phone that it's just stress. 2 days ago, Priya texted me. "We had a small electrical event last night, but it's resolved. Hope you're doing well." She likes neutral words. Event. Resolved. She included a screenshot of a badge activity log for the basement door because she knows me. My badge ID pinged that door 3 times at 3:07 a.m. I turned my badge in the day I left. It should be deactivated. In the screenshot, the reason field said manual override. I told myself a tech had cloned the number for testing. I told myself anything that would keep my morning coffee down. Last night, I went to take out the trash and smelled heat in the hallway. That coppery sweetness on the back of my tongue. My building is old and has those radiator boxes that hiss and smell like dust when they wake up. I told myself it was that. In my entryway mirror, I adjusted my coat and had this moment where the me in the mirror looked left over my shoulder before I did, like he was checking for something he didn't want me to see. I turned fast and saw only my own door in the peephole like a dead black eye. I laughed and said out loud, "No," like you say to a pet nipping at your hand. Then in the quiet after the laugh, I heard a single slow knock from the other side of my door. Not at my door, but on it like someone standing in my hall using a metal tool to tap the wood, because that's how they can say hello. I didn't open it. I waited with my hand on the knob and counted to 60 twice. The knock didn't come again. The smell softened and folded into the stale apartment air until it was gone. I slept on the couch with the TV on mute and woke from a dream in which I was standing outside the server room glass, wearing a uniform that wasn't mine, holding something heavy in my right hand angled down the way you do when you don't want to scare someone, and someone behind me whispered my name like a warning I'd heard my whole life. Today I sat down to write this and I keep stopping to look at the mirror, half expecting the me in it to blink late or smile at a joke only he understands. The elevator in my building groans like an old man. Sometimes it stops at my floor and opens to no one, with rain damp in its corners. I could tell myself I'm imagining it. I'd like to. But when I took the trash out just now, I found a wrench in the bottom of the bin, old, soot-stained along one edge and a shape like a thumb. I don't own a wrench. I went to throw it away and hesitated because throwing it away felt like inviting something to look for it. I put it back in the bin anyway and closed the lid and walked away without looking at my reflection in the glass of the stairwell door, because I don't want to know which one of us would look back first.